Thanks everyone. Welcome to Quantum Photonics Club, and this is Sierra. Today we are going to talk about brain-machine interface, and we are honored to have the Dr. Miguel Nicolelis and also Dr. Ronald Cicurel with us. So I hope you guys can enjoy the discussion. So first, let me kindly pass the mic to Katerina and Cecile. Please do a quick introduction. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me, Sierra, and for having this room. It's an honor to be here. I'm Katerina. I am a neuroscientist. I did my master's in Germany back in 2005, and then I actually was at Duke University and at NYU for my Ph.D. And then I did different postdocs, and now I'm at an assistant professor at NYU and the Nathan Klein Institute. And I mostly work with mental health-related disorders research, such as anxiety disorders, OCD, and so on. But at George Augustine's lab and some other projects, I also worked on optogenetic development and genetic such as chloride indicators and so on. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate to be here.
Hello everyone. We are very glad to have a very eminent figures in neuroscience on our stage right now. I'm Cecile, and I've been here in our club in quantum photonics, and I'm involved in other industry as a serial entrepreneur, but I'm involved in industrial industries and semiconductors, robotics, welding equipment, but I have been studying neuroscience and physics a lot, and math. So on stage right now is Dr. Ronald Cicurel. He is a mathematician, an Egyptian mathematician now based in Switzerland, and he had written several books together with Dr. Miguel Nicolelis, one of the most famous, if not the leading, most influential neuroscientist, neurobiologist in 2018. So you've met Dr. Ronald last week, and he discussed about the book on brain-centric. So I had known Ronald for quite some time now, and I have learned a lot from him. He is almost like family because he lives near my cousin in Switzerland. And I have learned so much from his knowledge in mathematics and physics. So Dr. Ronald, may I request you to please introduce Dr. Nicolelis because you have worked with him for a long time. I give the floor to you, Dr. Ronald.
Thank you, Cecile. Thank you so much. And I'm happy that you say you have learned from me. I must say I have learned from you. I think if somebody reads only what Cecile posts on Facebook, it's enough to make a complete culture in science and what's happening in the world. So thank you, Cecile. Well, you said that Miguel was a very famous neuroscientist, and I think he's even much more than that. He's an incredible human being. Incredible. It's the most amazing human being I ever met in my whole life. And I can tell you I met many people. Let me give you just one or two examples, if I can, in 2 or 3 minutes, of what I mean by amazing human being. I won't say anything about neuroscience because he's so well known for his work in neuroscience. But what is not well known from everybody, I'll come to that later. Let me first tell you how I met Miguel. I met Miguel, I think it was in 2004 or 2005. He was on sabbatical in EPFL in Lausanne, and I was starting to discuss with a common friend who's Henry Markham on this Blue Brain project. many people were there, but the only person I could really listen to was Miguel. Miguel, although he is a specialist, he is much more than a specialist. We can discuss any subject with him. He is so eclectic and has a very deep interest. We can feel that his answers are not only based on his scientific knowledge, but on his knowledge of humanity, of where things come from, how human beings have strived, have fought, have made mistakes to arrive where we are now. So I must say, friendship installed itself quite quickly. A few years later, I think it was in 2010, one day I get a phone from Miguel. Oh, I would like you to translate the text because I'm nominated at the French Academy of Science and I must make a speech. And I would like you to translate my speech into French because I want to speak in French. And I can tell you Miguel's French is worth my Japanese, so it's worth nothing. And I was amazed that he wanted to do, by respect for the audience, his speech in French. So I translated in French. Then I thought, well, I have to go to Paris, or he told me to come to Paris. So I arrived in Paris the morning where he was meant to give his speech, and he had learned it by heart. And it was a very hot day, I think it was in June, and he was sweating and repeating this text by heart in French. He absolutely wanted to say it in French and was asking me questions on the pronunciation of each word. I was thinking, few people have this quality of wanting to make things perfect, wanting to respect his audience, to respect the people he was with so profoundly, to make his speech in French. And he did do it in French, and it was a huge success, although he was in a hurry to do it. And that's the other aspect of Miguel. And why was he in a hurry? Because it was the World Cup, the Football World Cup, and he wanted to see the match. So the speech must have been finished before the match starts. And that's what happened. We finished the speech and we went to meet the football. And I saw two different aspects of Miguel in a single 1 hour. The Miguel, the brilliant scientist, and the brilliant football fan. And I understand why he loves football, because football is typically an uncomputable thing. It needs a high level of intelligence that no algorithm can simulate. So for me it's natural that he loves football. So those are two things that I can say about Miguel, but I must say a third one who will give you this human aspect that Miguel has. I think few people know that he's founder in Natal, who is a very poor region in north of Brazil, of a school for children who would be in the street doing all sorts of stupid things if there was not this school. And the school was a huge success, and Miguel was fighting every day to maintain the school, to find its financing, to see how the students studied. And I had the big chance of going a few times with different people to visit the schools that Miguel has built in Natal, and it was something I can tell you. You go in there and you see a young Brazilian sitting on a chair reading Scientific American. It is really an amazing thing he did, and it shows you how devoted he is to deeper things, to things who are purely human. So it's a person that I admire very much, and I'm sure he has a lot for us to say this evening. So I'll pass you back the microphone, Sarah or Miguel or Cecile.
Now we welcome on stage Dr. Miguel Nicolelis. We are very honored to have you here. May you I'll pass the mic to you to speak about your work or about your message to the audience.
Well, thank you very much, Cecile, Sierra, and of course, my Egyptian brother, Ronald. I'm very honored to be here with you guys today. I appreciate the kind invitation and, of course, the wonderful introduction by Ronald that only he and my mother could do. So thank you very much, my friend. And well, I thought I would just speak a little bit, and then I guess we can see what interests people the most, because the subject can be very broad, and at the same time, there are a lot of things that papers and talks, official talks, and scientific papers cannot communicate about, a discovery or a field that, as Ronald knows very well, when John Chapin, my former postdoctoral advisor, and I proposed that we wanted to do this thing, linking brains to machines, we got a letter from a reviewer at NIH for a little proposal that we placed at the end of the 90s to do a pilot study, and the response came saying that Dr. Chapin and nikol'élis urgently need professional help of the psychiatric variety, because the idea they are proposing will never work. And John and I look at that, and as usual, we laughed together. And I was, in fact, thinking about John today because this year, at the end of this year, by September, I guess I can say that we can celebrate the 25th anniversary of the first conversation I had with John in 1996, when 2 years after I moved to Duke from his lab in Philadelphia, I came back in town for a talk in some meeting that I don't recall. And of course, John took me for dinner. And that night, I told him that we had succeeded in translating this technique that we had worked together when I was his postdoc to record the electrical activity of hundreds of neurons simultaneously. That's what I came from Brazil to Philadelphia to do in his lab, because I guess at that point, we are the only two people in the world that would be crazy enough to try to venture into a full-scale technology development that would allow neurophysiologists to do that. Until then, basically the entire field was content to record action potentials coming from an individual neuron, mainly in anesthetized animals. And John and I had the same view that would not take us too far. Neuroscience was enamored with the single neuron properties, or the properties of individual brain cells. But it was obvious to us since the beginning that you could not understand that universe, the brain, by looking at one star at a time. You had to look at big chunks of the brain simultaneously to actually understand what it does. So I came to Philadelphia and I told John, you don't know this, but in this last year, I just moved the entire technology to monkeys. So we can actually record now 100 cells in monkeys, not only rats. And we were having dinner on a very famous restaurant for the famous Philadelphia cheesesteak. That was in Geno's. And I was talking to John, look, now that we have the way to record 100 cells, we need to come up with different paradigms to study the brain. We cannot just do what we used to do, collect the data, go home, and spend months analyzing properties of individual neurons. We need to produce or generate new paradigms, new strategies to basically investigate what are the actual principles that guide the behavior of large populations of neurons in a behaving animal, not in an anesthetized animal. And we are there going back and forth with these ideas, eating our foot-long cheesesteak, the best in the galaxy, although I found a place in North Carolina that is close second to it. And then I don't remember who, the two of us were exchanging ideas very frenetically. That was the way that, we work for almost 20 years together. And we said, well, what about if we link brains to machines, like robots, a robotic leg or robotic arm, and then since we can control the output, we can control the actuator very well, we can do whatever we want and measure anything we want, we can actually close the link between a brain and a device, and we can study how the brain reacts to it. And I remember very vividly that we both got a kick out of this idea, and suddenly a truck driver that was behind me, sitting behind me eating his own cheesesteak, stood up, came to me, to both of us, because we had just mentioned, well, let's call it brain-machine interfaces. This huge guy just stood up there, looked at us and said, that's a very good name. So we got instantaneous peer review acquiescence for our idea, and 25 years later, every time I think about this, it's almost a joke, but it has become a huge deal. And we actually did what we planned during that dinner. In fact, I found some notes a couple years ago, some notes that I brought back from Philadelphia, planning the experiments that we wanted to do. We first did that in rodents because it was the safer way to do it. And we got a little rat with only 48 neurons to control a 1 degree of freedom robotic arm to move, which was kind of a crazy thing. When we published, nobody would believe it. And in fact, we tried all major journals and people simply wouldn't believe it. So we published in a new journal that was coming out. It's very famous now, Nature Neuroscience. But at that time, it was not. And then a year later, this was 1999, because I had to wait until I published the entire method in monkeys in 1998 to validate the technique and to show to people that we could record. And more important than that, we could keep these recordings going on for months, which was a big shock to the entire community, because these animals were behaving, they're performing tasks, all sorts of tasks, and we were recording the same sample of neurons, not necessarily the same cells continuously, but for a long period of time. And a year later, in 2000, after the rat paper shocked the neuroscience community, we published in Nature our first monkey paper. And I'll never forget that, because we are in the Society for Neuroscience meeting, the annual meeting in the US, that gets every neuroscientist in the planet. And we are just publishing that week in Nature. We are presenting the poster. There were hundreds of people around our poster. And that huge mess with the vote between Al Gore and George Bush exploded in Florida. So we had the whole day talking to everybody about that. But at night, the entire country, the entire world was glued to the TV showing the fact that the election had not been decided and it would be a fight. So unfortunately, despite the fact that the paper came in Nature, it was a huge deal. There was very little talk about that because everybody wanted to talk about the election that was stolen or that never happened. So a couple years later, we came up with an even bigger study in rhesus monkeys, huge, because now we are showing that everything generalized. It doesn't matter which mammalian brain you're using. We could get these animals to do very complex tasks, three-dimensional control, all sorts of objects, virtual objects, robotic objects. And we published the first part of that. And again, when we sent it to Science, we got a reviewer that said, oh, that cannot happen. That cannot be possible. How could these monkeys be learning these tasks and doing that by controlling this 7 degree of freedom robotic arm? And so we had to, and when we got the review, we had 2 favorable reviews and 1 against it. The editor would not argue. They didn't allow us to reply to the crazy guy who he was fighting data and evidence. So I decided that I had enough of that. So we went to another new journal called PLOS Biology. And we published there this paper. And last time I saw it a few years ago, it was still one of the top 10 cited papers in PLOS Biology, despite the fact that the focus of pulse biology is much more molecular, genetic, very, very different from the systems biology that we are doing at that time. So 2 years later, we realized that we could try that in humans, but during intraoperative recordings that neurosurgeons need to do in patients that were receiving a deep brain stimulator for Parkinson's, well, the surgeons use electrodes to record as they penetrate the brain, get deep into it, to install this device. So we adapted some electrodes that were FDA approved, and we actually recorded during the surgery. And we were able to show that the same models, the same general strategy that we had used in monkeys to get a brain-machine interface to work, worked in humans. Again, we sent that to Nature, and the Nature reviewer said, well, what the hell you want to publish here? You already published this in monkeys. This was a guy I discovered years later because he volunteered to me. It was a theoretical neuroscientist who worked in monkeys with some experimentalists working in monkeys, and he didn't realize that was the first demonstration in human beings that the thing could work. So he wouldn't accept the paper. So we had to publish that in Journal of Neurosurgery, to give you an idea. But, that was 2004. Long and behold, we kept working on that, and finally, John and I knew, because after collecting data in all sorts of preparations, all sorts of experiments, we knew that it would work in humans. And so, a few years later, after I met Ronald, he may remember this, Brazil was rewarded with the 2014 World Cup. And I decided to do the craziest thing I ever did in my life. I went to the president of Brazil and then to the president of FIFA, or the secretary general of FIFA, and said, look, what about if we had in the opening ceremony of the World Cup a Brazilian paraplegic delivering the opening kickoff using the first brain-controlled lower limb robotic exoskeleton to show that to 25 million people who are today paralyzed due to a spinal cord injury, that science is getting close to do something for them. And believe it or not, it worked. And they said, okay, if you can deliver this, we'll go for it. And I never forget this, leaving the presidential palace in Brasilia, in our capital here, sitting in the middle of the True Power Square, in which it's a huge open space between the Supreme Court, the presidential palace, and Congress, taking my tie off, probably the second time I had a tie in my life, and thinking, well, now I have to get it done. Because, of course, at that point, I didn't have anything. I hadn't worked with humans besides the intraoperative recordings. And long and behold, we created this international collaboration, non-profit collaboration called the Walk Again Project, and about 150 people from 25 different countries came to collaborate on this, opening their patents, bringing their students, working for free. And we actually, on June 12, just a few days ago, we celebrated the 7th anniversary of it. On June 12, 2014, on the field here in São Paulo, where the opening ceremony of the World Cup happened, we actually had a former athlete, a Brazilian guy who had been paralyzed due to a very huge spinal cord injury at thoracic level, 9 years prior at that time, delivered the opening kickoff. And once I went to China to give a talk there, I went to this studio, the public TV there, and it was the anniversary of the kick a few years ago. And one of the TV executives gave me a plate showing that they registered the audience of that kick worldwide, and it was about 1.2 billion people watching that thing. And the kicking itself was very meaningful, but it was not the biggest point of the entire story, because a few weeks later, we took all the patients to the lab, and when we redid the neurological examination that we had to do every 3 months with these guys, we are completely shocked to realize that all these patients, the 8 patients that trained for 6 months with us, had experienced a partial neurological recovery below the level of the injury, despite the fact that some of them had remained paralyzed for more than a decade. So they all showed the capability of contracting voluntarily muscles below the injury. They could feel their bodies. It was not completely normal, but they still recover tactile pain sensation, proprioception, vibration sensation. And they also recover visceral functions like bladder control. So we had started with the idea that brain-machine interfaces could be just a new paradigm to investigate the properties, the physiological properties of the brain. And by that summer in 2014, we had realized that when you place a human being with an injury, like a spinal cord injury, in the middle of a control loop that takes the subject's brain activity to control devices, and the devices provide visual and tactile feedback to the subjects, we could induce partial neurological recovery in these people. Something that I never dreamed I would see in my life, because when I was in medical school here in São Paulo, my neurology teacher, when I told him that I want to go into brain, I wanted to be a neurosurgeon at that time, but when I realized the neurosurgeons, 99% of their time is pre-routine, I decided that I couldn't survive that kind of life. He told me, look, whatever you do, never get into clinical neurology because you're never going to see any of your patients recover. And that afternoon here in São Paulo, I was about, less than a kilometer from the medical school, University of São Paulo. I could only think about this guy, thinking with myself, what would he think if he would see these patients walking by themselves with a little help, even without the exoskeleton? Some of them were able to regain a pretty decent degree of autonomous walking, just with some body support. So, since then, of course, we have done all sorts of things. This research has generated many spin-offs in Parkinson's disease, chronic epilepsy, many discoveries in basic science. So I guess I can say that the little cheesesteak that I shared with John Chapin 25 years ago yielded much more than I ever dreamed in my wildest dreams. So we have one of the most exuberant and fast-growing fields in modern neuroscience. I actually believe that brain-machine interface research rescue systems neuroscience from extinction, because most of neuroscience was going into genetics, molecular biology, individual molecules, individual synapses, a very big reductionist approach. And I wanted to go into the opposite direction. Totally, John Chapin and I, of course. And I think we made a case that to really understand what I like to call the true creator of everything, reductionism is not going to do it, not by a long shot. You may study every molecule you want, every cell is very fun. I love to see all sorts of results that people are getting right now that I never dreamed we would be able to do. But if we want to explain the brain and how it generates behavior, that's not the way to go. You need to look at the forest. Otherwise, if you only look at one tree at a time, you're never going to understand how the forest behaves. So I guess I stop here and, be open to whatever discussion you guys want to have.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Nicolelis. It was really amazing to hear that story. I saw the speech that you gave in, I think, World Science Festival about that. And it was more than an hour, but even up to now, while you talk about the thing that happened, it still excites me, and I'm amazed that you have done a lot of things that we never knew before. Because when we talk about brain-computer interface and talking about it in terms of popular science, I remember that when they first showed that about the kickoff in Brazil in the Olympics, when you made a paraplegic guy made his first kick, taking 12 steps and feeling his feet as if it's an extension. his feet was touching the ground, and he was using an exoskeleton. It was amazing to all of us, and there were many of us who were your fans who really applauded that. But looking at the details of what you're saying now, it's very amazing when you said that you're bringing the study of neuroscience back into systems. So Shara will reset the room, and later on maybe Katarina will lead the questions that will be asked from our audience. So Shara, I pass the mic to you.
Yeah, thanks Cecile, and thanks Miguel for the brief introduction. And I think we have lots of questions from the audience. I will invite some people. I know they are your big fans, and they already chased for your work for several years. So I will kindly invite them up and see what comments they have. Thank you. Hi, Abis, Isaac, and Ryan. Welcome to join the stage. Abis, I know you have tons of questions. Maybe you can start. Thank you.
Thank you, Sierra. Professor Nicolelis, it's an honor to talk to you, and Professor Cicurel as well. I've been following your work for almost 8 years now. I'm also kind of into the study of brain-computer interfaces, although I've looked into some of the methodologies that you used, which is really groundbreaking and pioneering in a way. So I guess some of my questions is that you mentioned that some of the brain implants are actually operating without any kind of detrimental effect to the subjects that you place the electrode in, and I'm kind of curious, does it have to do with anything the biocoding that you're using, or are you trying to make adjustments to the potential signal loss, or at least the reduction of the signal to noise ratio over time? Because I think one of the most prominent problems when it comes to invasive brain-machine interface or brain-computer interface is that there's a cluster of glial cells surrounding the electrodes, and that seems to kind of reduce the amount of signals that are picked up from certain neuronal population. So I'm kind of curious how you're able, at least I managed to get a good signal fidelity despite this biological obstacle.
Yeah, basically we discovered early on in the late 90s, actually when I was still a postdoc in end of 93, that if you use blunt tip flexible metals covered with Teflon isonel, so hair-like filaments, metal filaments that can actually move with the brain and have not a sharp tip, but a blunt tip, you actually take advantage of this gliosis that develops over time as a reaction to the implant. In fact, the signal to noise tends to enhance in the first few days, in the first week or so. And after that, the recordings become very stable. So we had, for instance, monkeys that I recorded from 2009 to 2018. So the same animal. And this was very different than the use of these rigid probes, these knife daggers that people use, like the Utah probe. In fact, I had reported that for almost 20 years now, that everybody that uses these rigid silicon-based daggers, the famous 10 by 10, which is very short, it can only penetrate a small depth into the brain. The recordings last for just a few weeks or even a few days, because, as you said, the gliosis will create an interface between the fine tip of the electrode and the neuronal sample around the tip. So for us, the gliosis was a blessing, because since we had blunt tips with diameters that vary from 45 to 15 microns, particularly in the 40 micron range, you could see that the recordings were not that great the day after the surgery, but a week later they were fabulous. So we had the best signal-to-noise ratio in chronic recorders published in the literature since the late 90s. And they continue all these years in humans, monkeys, rodents, mice or rats. The result is always the same, and the yield is always the same. It's about 1 neuron per microwire implanted. Some microwires can give you more than 1 neuron, 4 or 5, but some may not work. So when you take the average of these big implants, you see that is across about 1 neuron per microwire, independently of the species that you are implanting. And just to make sure that people don't get confused, everything we did in humans for the World Cup, and since the World Cup was done with non-invasive technology called electroencephalography in humans, after that original study in Parkinsonian patients, intraoperative recordings, we use non-invasive technology because we realized that what the paraplegic patients need in terms of resolution of the electrical signals do not require any invasive implants. We could do it with scalp recordings.
So we mentioned this a little bit before we started this room. So I have a few questions we might get to, but I just wanted to go to this one quickly, is that your work that the two of you guys had been on that you're mentioning now has its similarities to Neuralink that's become pretty famous the last few months especially. So, and Dr. Ronald Cicurel mentioned that would be good to go over the distinctions there. So can you tell us a little bit about how the work you guys have been involved in is different from what Neuralink has been?
Well, that's a very curious subject because I have been talking about that for a couple of years now. Since, Neuralink was founded by, among other people, 3 of my former students. In fact, Max, the CEO, was an undergrad in my lab for a few years. And the 2 other guys, the scientists, Tim and Joey, were PhD students in my lab. I was their advisors. And, they're all very good people. And Tim is one of the greatest engineers I ever met. But I had no idea that they were going to create this company with Mr. Musk. And what I noticed is, and I knew that because both Joey, Max, but particularly Joey and Tim are engineers. And they are in love with technology development, but not as much involved or knowledgeable about clinical aspects of this field. And also the basic science aspects of it. So when I saw what Neuralink was doing, I soon realized that it was mainly technology development, but summed or covered by a huge dose of hype that Mr. Musk contributed, and that was his sole contribution to the whole effort. It looks like, besides the money, was to hype it up what could be done. And funny enough, over the last year and a half or so, I was kind of amused to see that Neuralink was one by one repeating the experiments that we had done 10, 20 years ago in the lab, particularly when these guys were in the lab. So I didn't quite understand what was the big deal of getting a monkey to play Pong, since we had done that in 2 dimensions, not in 1 dimension, and in 3 dimensions in 2000 or 2003, or when they had a pig in a treadmill. I was kind of baffled because we had done that in monkeys in 2006. So to this day, I quite don't understand what Neuralink is about. Certainly, I don't see any breakthrough that I would, be stunned by. I kind of feel that the hype has taken it over, since I heard Mr. Musk certain times suggesting that they are going to use this technology to create telepathy, or to upload content in human brains, or download your brain into a CD-ROM or into the cloud, so you leave your memories and emotions and your autobiography, for posterity. And this is all fun as science fiction. Certainly will never happen. And Ronald and I have written a monograph about our view of what are the non-computable aspects of the human brain that will never be able to be digitized or downloaded or uploaded. So I kind of, to be quite honest, I felt pretty disappointed and actually almost sad that so much marketing and hype had been placed on an effort that, as far as I can tell, is not going anywhere, or at least not breaking the ground that you would expect a startup with infinite resources and very good people who I know very well, too well, in fact. I find it kind of a underachieving effort that so far I don't see where it is going to go and what concrete products or breakthroughs is going to produce. I don't see any at this point.
May I just add, Miguel, that it's also probably very dangerous for science. You and I, we have both known blue brain, human brain, and all these tentatives to simulate the brain. And Neuralink is a similar thing, driven by hype and not by science, not by knowledge. And a lot of funding, a lot of money, a lot of hope is going into there, hope that can only be deception after a certain time, like it's happened now for the human brain, who after 10, 15 years has led nowhere. So I think it's nearly our duty to say, open up your eyes, be careful, don't let people tell you anything, and don't go for it because there's a big name or a powerful man behind it. I wanted just to add that.
Yeah, this is a very important issue because you know as well, Ronald, that there has been a lot of backlash in Europe in neuroscience because of that project that promised very quickly to simulate the human brain and never got to simulate any brain or anything really meaningful. There was a huge backlash, and what I fear is that by raising these false expectations and these ideas that will never materialize, companies like Neuralink may actually deceive the people, and people may lose interest or support from ideas that will happen and will work, like treating neurological patients with spinal cord injury or Parkinson's or even chronic epilepsy or depression. These ideas are basically supported by very good evidence published now and by many groups around the world. But if you keep saying that the objective is telepathy, it's going to be a little difficult to convince people that we all serious scientists doing what we do. So I think this is a good point, well taken point.
Yes. You mentioned downloading the brain, downloading feelings or memories in a computer, or the other way around, injecting memories or injecting realities in human brains. This whole movement of transhumanism seems to me quite dangerous for science. Obviously, they are certainly doing also good things, but giving false hopes, false directions, false objectives will not lead us anywhere. And there should be people who denounce this, who explain why it's not possible to download or upload a brain in a computer. And I think we are relatively lonely in speaking about that.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel. About Neuralink, I guess I kind of agree. But maybe do you think they might have some improvement about like signal side? Maybe they get a better accuracy signal and they can get more quality brain imaging. And then also, currently we have much like advanced algorithm to process that data. So I guess if they don't do any fundamental improvement, maybe they kind of can integrate the like brain machine interface, this approach to the current like VI AI and VR technologies and do some improvement. How do you like kind of look at these different technologies integration? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think it's a technical issue, even because since my students were there, they were using the things that they know work, because they have seen with their own eyes, and they saw our lab operation, running many projects simultaneously, and they knew how reliable these flexible electrodes are. First, they created a robot to implant these electrodes in large numbers. Well, that was a project that team wanted to do in my lab in 2006, and I said, look, it's not worth our time. We are not a tech developing enterprise. We are a basic science and now applied science laboratory. There's no market for this robot. It's going to be very expensive, and the number of implants that we are going to do in the future very likely do not justify, even because a lot of the patients can take advantage of non-invasive brain-machine interfaces. You see, we had a few days ago, a paper from a group at Stanford doing the implants to allow people to communicate via computers. Well, that has been done in 1999 by Professor Birnbaumer and Tübingen University. We're using EEG. And yes, this is slow, and it got better over the last 20 years or so, but you don't need a neurosurgery to do that. And patients will not want to take a risk of a neurosurgery, despite the fact that it's a simple procedure to implant this type of electrodes in the surface of the brain. Why take the chances if you can do that with something like a swimming cap that you just place on your scalp, and you do it, and then you take it away, and there's no risk whatsoever. The problem is, what I feel in the field is there are very few people who have any experience in dealing with patients and medicine. There's a lot of engineers that want to develop gizmos and better algorithms and better mathematics and better computer science. I understand that. It's fascinating, and I enjoy it very much, but you have to realize that what we want to do for our pleasure as engineers or scientists in our labs does not necessarily apply directly to the wishes and desires of a patient who has been paralyzed for a decade. When I talk to patients during the Walk Again project, what they really wanted, one of the guys looked at me and said, I just want to control my bladder. I want to have independence. I don't want to have to call someone to help me go to the bathroom every time. And that was a very good warning to me. It made me recalibrate my expectations and what I wanted to do. Because, no, they didn't want an implant. They wanted to be able to walk, of course. But they didn't want to take a chance of having anything implanted if they could do everything with a non-invasive approach. Sure, there will be cases in which you have no option if the patient is completely paralyzed and there are other complications. You may have to do it, but the judgment has to be one that takes as a priority the well-being, the safety of the patient, not our wishes or fetishes in terms of technology development. And I see that a lot in the field. A lot of young guys just crave the gizmo, not to actually get someone happy walking again. And that's not the reason I put this field into high gear 25 years ago. I wanted to study the brain for sure. That was the initial priority. But now that I have seen the clinical benefits, I want to pursue them. But according to what is as a priority, the well-being of the patients, not my own ideas of what kind of spiffy technology I want to develop.
Yeah, that's right. So since like the brain-computer interface, that's really a powerful technology, and I think we have lots of ethical issue and lots of risk before we really need to development and use this kind of technology in people's daily life. So I also agree the runners. Yeah, I think currently the Neuralink, most of the researchers in this field, they may like think more about how to development on how to engineering a much like fancy product instead of like they need to kind of focus on and also think more about how we can really deal with human and then think about humanity as the first priority. So since Miguel, you mentioned about the different approach, we have the invasive way and the non-invasive way and also like semi-invasive way. How do you look at them now and how do you think which one is more promising in general? Thank you.
Yeah, I guess the invasive approach is the original approach that I developed, and of course I'm very fond of what it can produce in terms of tools to investigate brains in experimental animals. And that is very important. Now we have done all sorts of variations of the original design. We have created what we call brain-to-brain interfaces, a brain-machine-brain interface in which the entire dialogue between the brain and the machine is done independently of the body and its peripheral sensors. So you can get signals out of the brain to control a device. Let's say a virtual hand. That virtual hand is scanning a surface, so collecting some sort of tactile information. That tactile information is delivered directly into the somatosensory cortex, the part of the cortex that is fundamental for processing touch. So this is a brain-machine-brain interface. We also develop something that I call brain nets, in which animals, and we already have done that using non-invasive technology in humans, animals collaborate mentally to achieve a particular collective motor task. And that has been absolutely phenomenal because we were able to record from 2 or 3 monkeys interacting in some instances in a social setting. And we are able to see what happens in the brains of 2 animals, for instance, pair of animals in a colony when they're interacting in a social task. And what we found was, nobody had seen it. It was something really stunning. So in that sense, we have discovered new neuroscience, information that would be almost, is completely unknown because nobody had recorded wirelessly hundreds and hundreds of neurons in 2 brains interacting. At the same time, we saw with this approach, because if you use the invasive approach, you get a very high resolution of electrical activity from individual neurons and lots of them at the same time. We saw that the motor cortex that everybody thought for half a century, no more, 100 years, more than 100 years, almost 150 years, was only related to control motion. We found the cells there code, for instance, for expectation of reward, whether the reward has been matched or not, based on that expectation. The neurons encode for space, external space, like place cells in the hippocampus. We found that the same kind of cells exist in the motor cortex. Like I said, these cells can represent social parameters, hierarchy in a social group, like differences between a dominant monkey and a lower rank monkey. In fact, we saw all sorts of parameters that were associated with other areas of the brain being encoded by neurons in in the poor cousin called the primary motor cortex, that everybody in neuroscience thought it was very low in the hierarchy of these huge, associative areas, hippocampus. So we saw that everything is highly distributed. So to do science, fundamental basic science, neuroscience, this approach is phenomenal. Now, as I said, when you cross the border to clinical applications, I think you can do a lot of it non-invasive. And as you progress, you can judge what is the border in which clinical progress has ended or it has plateaued, because it does after a few months or years of training. And then you can, together with the patients, make a judgment in the future whether it's worthwhile from a clinical point of view to have a procedure. I can tell you that in one of the neuroprosthetic devices that we developed for Parkinson's disease, which is completely counterintuitive to mainstream of therapy in the field, but is showing tremendous promise as a big alternative and not as invasive at all compared to deep brain stimulation, we realized that if we stimulate a certain location of the spinal cord, the surface of the spinal cord, we don't need to penetrate there, we can get effects, anti-Parkinsonian effects that nobody could believe, particularly in patients who suffer from a common ailment that is the freezing condition, in which the patient cannot walk anymore. It's completely frozen by Parkinson's. And since neither medication nor deep brain stimulation work very well for this, we found out that stimulating the spinal cord at high frequency, for reasons that are more technical, is almost like defibrillating the brain. We were able to actually get these patients to walk. And this now has been reproduced all over the world. So it all depends on the equation of what you want to get out of it, whether it's a basic science question or a clinical therapy, versus the safety of the patients and what is the benefit if you're talking about clinical applications versus basic science.
Hey, Miguel. I'm very honored. I'm a big fan. Thank you so much for being here and talking about it. I'm very interested in those results that you have, that if one subject was trained performing some task, it could basically train a second subject faster, and actually that brain increased the signal to noise ratio to communicate better, basically to be rewarded. And I was thinking if this approach is also possible with non-invasive techniques, and also in humans, let's say we would record, because I'm mostly working with anxiety disorders and so on. I was thinking when I read your work, if one could record a subject that is, for example, not anxious in a specific situation, and if one could communicate that to the subject that is anxious or has a phobia, and if basically extinction training could be done more efficiently and better by using your technique. Would that be possible in the emotional learning, or do you think there's a difference there?
Yeah, I think you may be referring to the brain-to-brain experiments that actually Miguel Paes Vieira, a Portuguese postdoc, did in my lab before he went back home. And in fact, we did that in rats, but these were circumscribed to connecting the brains of two rats, in which the first animal had to make a motor decision given a visual cue whether to press a left or right lever. And what we did was to get this brain activity in the motor cortex during this process of decision making by this first animal, the instructor. And we sent it to a second animal that had not received the visual cue and had to wait for the instruction's brain message to decide whether he pressed the left or right lever. And Miguel and I found out that, to our shock, 70% of the time that happened. The second animal, the decoder, let's call the first one the encoder, the decoder was able to make a decision that was correct. It was in sync with the decision that the encoder made. But of course, there were trials in which the second guy committed an error. The decoder got it wrong. And what we noticed when we analyzed the behavior of this dyad, these two animals interacting by brain exchange, brain signal exchange, is that after the second animal committed, let's say, a couple errors, the encoder, because what I didn't mention is that every time the decoder got it right, the encoder would get an extra allotment of reward, of water. So, of course, the encoder enjoyed the fact that he was getting extra water, and he had no clue why, but every time the second animal got it right, the guy who generated the command that was transmitted to the second brain got an extra reward. And so what we noticed is when the decoder committed mistakes in a series, the first animal, without any supervision from us, any intervention from us, he slowed down. The signal-to-noise ratio of his brain increased, and the entire decision window increased in time. Almost like saying, look, idiot, I'm getting you a better signal-to-noise. Get it right because I want my extra reward. And they actually did. Invariably, when the signal-to-noise improved and the length of the pattern of brain activity of the encoder increased, the second guy got it right. So after that, the encoder returned to his lousy encoding brain pattern, very much lower signal-to-noise and very fast decision until the decoder committed errors again. And so he went back to the idiot-proof strategy of increasing the signal-to-noise and enhancing the window of the decision-making process. So in that sense, what we saw was that these two individuals were computing together. They became, by all purposes and means, an analog computer, interacting with one another via this one-directional brain transmission and this one-directional behavioral signal that the decoder would inform the encoder by either getting it right or getting it wrong. But it was, a binary decision. We got it a little better. We got a few rats to exchange information. In a second paper, Miguel Vieira got a very beautiful organic computer working with multiple brains interacting among each other, and it worked. And then a group at University of Washington in Seattle began trying out this idea using non-invasive methods like EEG to record brain activity in one subject and delivering messages to one or other subjects via TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. So it was all done by non-invasive stuff. I don't think the same thing would work in a straightforward way for what you propose in terms of emotions, feelings. It's going to be very difficult because it's much more difficult to get signals that are very clear in the EEG that translate our deep emotions, as Ronan probably told you last week. But you may find indirect ways to put subjects in communication based on particular frequencies of the EEG. And this was something that was going on in the 60s with biofeedback, but it never involved, as far as I know, multiple subjects. I think there was only one study monkeys at the time, but it was the same subject, actually. I'm just recalling now. But this was done in the context of biofeedback. So if you're talking about motor decisions or tactile information, you may use this approach that we use, and it may work. But I suspect that it will be much more difficult when you move to higher order brain functions. As anything in brain-machine interfaces, we got lucky that we decided to start this field working with the motor cortex. If we had tried to work with the cingulate, things would be much more difficult, if not impossible. So that day, when John and I made the decision to start in the motor cortex, and that was new for us because we both, John was trained as a tactile physiologist, and I was learning to be a tactile physiologist myself. When we moved to the motor cortex, we were pretty much naive about the motor cortex, besides what we had read in the literature. So that caused some stir too on the motor cortex community. And it's funny because here we are studying the somatosensory cortex, which is a couple millimeters caudal to the motor cortex, and there's a sulcus right in the central sulcus is right between them. So just by crossing the sulcus, we got the wrath of the guys who were in the other side of the sulcus, like we're a new tribe, just getting in contact with the motor cortex tribe. And at that time, boy, it was ferocious. So one day, I guess I have to write a book about the sociology of neuroscience. That would be very interesting.
You guys mentioned a little bit about, well, you're starting to treat things that can help with paraplegic and perhaps quadriplegics. And you mentioned just a little bit on Parkinson's. So with all this work, what is it that you most hope to cure? You know, rather than just these, like, let's do telepathy like some other people are trying to get involved in. What are some specific things like Parkinson's and some advances in those areas that you potentially might be able to treat or even cure somehow?
Well, I just gave you these examples, but I have a theory that, in fact, I put in my new book, and we discuss in the monograph that Ronald and I wrote in 2015. I'm just writing this paper now because I feel that now I have a lot of evidence to support what I have been saying for years now, decades almost, since the mid of the 2000s with my students. When we study, we got these mice models of neurological and psychiatric disorders, and this is, a couple of my students, since we had perfected the technique of implanting microwires anywhere in the brain, I had a couple of students. One was Rui Costa, and the other was Cafui Drizza. We pioneered the recordings, multi-site recordings in behaving mice, including knockout mice and genetically modified mice that were used, and are still used, as models of different diseases. So what I discovered is that independently of the cause, the original cause, cell death or genetic modification or toxin, whatever it is that generates Parkinson's or all sorts of diseases that we tried, we always found that the phenotype of these diseases were associated with a particular type of seizure, a type of epileptic seizure or hypersynchrony, or in some cases hyposynchrony, lower synchronization. But most cases was a hypersynchronization of neurons in a particular subset of the brain. In Parkinson's disease was the motor system. In depression was the different components of the limbic system, and so on. So I came up with the idea that independently of whatever the causes is the primary cause of these disorders, it seems that the common physiopathological pathway for most, if not all, brain disorders, being neurological, psychiatric, and I don't make that distinction anymore myself. I think this is a false distinction, actually. It's all brain disorders. There is a seizure involved. And I start testing with this neuroprosthetic device that we can apply to the spinal cord, whether we could phase reset or defibrillate, let's say, like in the heart. When you go in fibrillation, you just give a shock and you defibrillate the heart. I reason with the same idea, whether we could defibrillate the brain, let's say, so to speak, and get people or animals out of this phenotype, either the trembling and shaking of Parkinson's or the chronic epilepsy that cannot be treated with medication, or even depression. So, and I realized that not only us, other groups did this too, following our initial papers, that it worked in animals, and some people have tried in humans, like in Parkinson's and chronic epilepsy, and it works. So I think that what I want to do is to see if this theory can hold, and for how many disorders, or if it's a general principle that can hold for anything, that you could approach with this strategy somewhat similar to what we did for Parkinson's disease. In fact, we have found evidence in the literature. Several friends of mine have come up with this and told me that even in Alzheimer's, there is a phase of rapid cell death in which people have shown that seizures magnify the process, and perhaps if you could interrupt the seizures at that point, you could, at the very minimum, slow down the process of cell death, and at best, you could, slow down so much that it would take decades for an effect that usually would happen in a few years. So that's, I think, what I'm going to pursue now. I think that after, 40 years in the business, next year I celebrate 40 years into this thing. I want to basically try to do at a larger scale what we did for the Walk Again project. Not only for spinal cord injury, but for a variety of neurological / psychiatric disorders.
So I have sort of like question. If you've been keeping up with some of the machine learning and deep learning algorithms, there are methods in which you can actually simultaneously decode streaming information. I think one of them is called, sequence to sequence with attention. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but in general, we have sort of like this explosion when it comes to developing deep learning models. Do you think that there is a possibility of replacing those as to the traditional methods that are used to kind of decode and filter, like from brain implants, like the Kalman filter or the ridge regression and other methods?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I had a postdoc, Paul Ha, that actually was involved in this study, the first study in which we recorded from multiple monkeys, 2 monkeys interacting socially, who actually tested a lot of new machine learning algorithms, and he found very beautiful results. So it's not like a quantum leap. It's not going to be many orders of magnitude, but you get better in some aspects of the decoding. So I have no problem in that. I see no. In fact, I see that is always very interesting. In reality, if you look at now brain-machine interface or brain-computer interface, do a literature search, a huge number, perhaps more than half of the papers deal with new decoding algorithms. So you have everything that people are inventing in big data analysis has been tried. So it's like a library of decoders. There are toolboxes now in which you can choose, or you can have many running in parallel, and I think that will be the future. But it's all very nice and very interesting, but it's a little remote from where I put my chips. I want to understand the brain, and I want to make new therapies for neurological disorders, and we can take every help we can from computer science and mathematics, but that is not the central focus of the field, I think. At least my take on the field. There's a lot of improvement that we can take advantage of in terms of decoders, and it will happen naturally. But I wouldn't just think that the main advance is going to come from that component of the whole thing. BMI has become extremely multidisciplinary field. You have roboticists designing robots just to interact with BMIs. So I take it again. I like to look at the developments in every field from above and try to integrate them. So that's just my particular point of view.
And also, like, there are multiple types of neural probes that have been used. There is one that you developed in your lab, and the Utah array is pretty much used, I think, with the BrainGate project. There's also NeuroPixel. There is also, I think, sort of like tungsten fibers from your former student, I think Jose Carmina. So do you think that there is kind of universality when it comes to designing probes that can be universally applied to do BCI or BMI?
Well, I don't think there is right now. I think we should have it. And it's very obvious that, for me, you should look at 25 years of research, accumulated research, that the Utah probe will, for me at least, will never be the choice because of all the limitations that I mentioned, the rigidity of the probes, how deep it goes, the lack of flexibility in the material, the gliosis, the inflammation that is produced by it and makes it not viable after a few weeks. It has been improved, but I really don't feel that what I envision in the future could be done with that. So I still believe that the good old flexible microwires, in whatever configuration you want to place, is the best choice. And I think no wonder that my good students at Neuralink opted to use them because they knew that there's nothing that can beat it. So I would rather, of course, there are many possibilities with new materials that would be interesting to explore. But if I had to choose today, I would still, believe it or not, after almost 30 years, I would still if I had to implant anything in my brain for the purpose of improving my function, my neurological functions, and according to some of my friends I may need it, I would use microwires at all times. I have no doubt. I'll tell the neurosurgeon, whatever you do, use microwires.
Dr. Miguel, Dr. Ronald, it's been really great to listen to you over the last 2 weeks, and some of the, especially the neurophysiological applications you talked about, and the conversation last week with Dr. Ronald also was very interesting. My question may be a little different, but I'm sure you'll have reflections on this. I am wondering about what you think are the applications or implications of this for psychological issues, which are rooted in emotion, thought, and the second part of that is, where do you see the future of this as potential, not only resolving problems, but as enhancements to the human system or human, the human sort of neurological apparatus. And I was wondering what do you think of that?
Well, I don't know if Ronald would like to start so I can get a glass of water here while I organize my thoughts.
I would gladly start. My thoughts are permanently disorganized, so it's not a problem for me. I'm always very skeptical when one wants to enhance human beings. I wonder what that really means, because if we want to enhance, it means that we already have a direction and we already know now what it means to be enhanced after. So we get in a sort of vicious circle where we do things to be better, then we adapt to what we have done, and it gives a sort of closed loop where there's no external control. I think that is rather dangerous. But instead of enhancing, I prefer the idea of helping or curing or bringing back to a to better possibility of living than enhancing. I don't understand deeply. I don't understand what enhancing can be. I think it's always a short-term vision to believe that we know what is better for us in the long term. We obviously know what we feel better for us tomorrow or next year or next 50 years. But on the long term, I wonder if enhancement is a good thing, because we gain certain capacities according to what we are thinking today. But conditions change, and what we are thinking today is not perhaps the right direction in which we should go. So I don't know if, Miguel, you had time enough to drink your glass of water. Let you continue.
Well, what can I add to a true descendant of Ra, the sun god of Egypt? Very little. I don't have enough wisdom accumulated to follow that. But what I can say is that I share your concern and your vision, Ronald, as you know, and it's somewhat similar. Of course, what most people don't realize is that we are enhancing ourselves every day. We don't need any piece of technology to actually enhance ourselves, because we have a system that is extremely plastic and is self-organizing, and is taking potential information from the external universe and basically finding the optimal solution for us to survive and to continue. And we have been doing that. Our primate family has been doing that for millions of years. And in fact, I found this very, very interesting, because the general aspect of the question, because I remember a few years ago reading, or trying to read, I couldn't finish, Steve Pinker's book, where he said, this is the best of times. We should be thankful, grateful. We should thank the cosmos for being alive right now, because in the history of humanity, by these indicators that I'm going to present in my book and make all the tech guys in Silicon Valley extremely happy to promote my book and sell it, we are fortunate enough to live in the 21st century. And I read the first chapter or two of the book, and I said, I don't think this guy has walked into the streets of Boston very often to see what is be alive today. And then the pandemic hit. And the pandemic, as you know, I don't need to tell you, exposed explicitly everywhere in the world, including the US, the huge fragilities of the development model, or the growth strategy that humanity has chosen by option, just a few of us, or by force, by most majority of us, to follow since the Industrial Revolution. And when the pandemic hit, when this little envelope of a little bit of fat and protein and one filament of RNA put the entire world on its knees, and was responsible for 600,000 deaths in the United States, the largest economy in the world, I wonder what Steve Pinker was thinking. Whether he still thought that we were living in the best of times. Because for my personal evaluation, after 15 months of quarantine here in São Paulo, working, as a scientist, deeply involved with the pandemic here, which is the worst in the world right now, I came to the realization there may not be that. Because our ancestors may have had a much better deal in a variety of sense. They were more connected to the natural environment. They had much lower expectations of what happiness actually meant. They work in groups, in social groups that needed to be very, very solid because otherwise nobody would survive. And our, what I like to call the church of markets and the god of money, they had not appeared to them yet. As you can see by the paintings on the Lascaux cave in Europe, these guys, when they had a chance, according to Ronald, to not only paint 15, 20,000 years ago, but he speak for the first time in a very structured way, what they had to say was nothing about their egos or their bank accounts or how many cars they had to something very profound to put in those walls, to paint in those rock walls, and that was about the world that surrounded them, because that was the center of their cosmology. And when I read about the Mongols that, have been put into history as these big villains, and when I realized that these guys had an analog god. The god was the sky, the big eternal blue sky. And when I realized that the Mongols created public education, they respected women's rights, they were all for a single governance of the entire planet, I was wondering with myself, we need to visit these guys again, because they were much better than I ever imagined. They had ideas that were simply sensational. And you may say, but these guys are primitive, they were in Central Asia, living on horses and killing people with arrows. And hey, Kublai Khan invented the credit card. Marco Polo went around China using a gold rectangle that I like to call the gold can card. And whatever Marco Polo needed to stop, to eat, to sleep, and to get new horses, he just presented the gold card with Kublai Khan signature. And everybody was happy enough to provide everything to Marco Polo for free. So I wonder what enhancement, as Ronald said, means.
Yes.
Because when I read with what the good ancestors of my good friend did in Egypt recently, I was wondering, I wanted to be there. I wanted to see that stuff.
Do you know, Miguel, that we had in Egypt 2,500 years before Christ, we had free medicine for everybody?
Free medicine, exactly, yeah.
Free medicine, it's incredible. But it's like this, this verbal system, this system where we put everything into words, where we digitalize everything, has taken over so much. We are convinced that it encompasses, it holds all reality, and we can describe all reality, and what we can express verbally is what is true and what can be done. And in fact, it's not the case, and we shouldn't let it penetrate all our mental space, all our thinking. We should realize that what we can say with word is only a part of reality, not the whole reality. And it's today we have let words and the verbal system penetrate everywhere. Money has penetrated in every sector of life, of human beings. If one could invent a machine to let everybody pay for every time he breathes, then the machine
I'll
would
give an
exist.
example, my friend. I'll give an example. An example that is very easy to understand, and I think you'll make the point you're trying to make. Look at professional sports, right? The Greek invented the Olympics because they thought that there was a way to honor the gods and to promote standards of, good character and behavior. And they were very proud of their athletes, but they were amateur athletes that came once a year. And there are many games, actually, not the only one that we talk about. Well, look what is happening today in the arena of professional sports. People want to run the Olympics in Japan when 80% of the population says that they don't want the games because they're afraid of the risks that bringing people from all over the world could bring to Japan, which it was in an emergency status just a few days ago. They're going to suspend that just to have the games. Then I'm watching on TV the Euro Cup, and I see these crowds in Budapest where they have vaccinated a lot of people, but yet full stadium, full of people without masks, hugging, screaming, cursing, all together as nothing had happened for the last 16 months. And I heard today that the European Soccer Federation is pressuring England to get rid of the lockdown final measures so they could have full stadiums for the semifinals and finals, despite the fact that the Indian variant is now responsible for 99% of the cases in Great Britain, and the cases are growing again. So here in South America, Brazil accepted to host the South American Cup with 9 delegations from South America coming to Brazil in the middle of a pandemic out of control that has produced 500,000 deaths. Today we reach 500,000 deaths. So what are we doing for celebrating this hedonism, this sports addiction that we have? Olympics, cup, soccer, whatever, basketball, have become more important than getting rid of the pandemic. Why?
If I can add, I'm very worried also that people cannot, at least here in the U.S. where I live currently, a lot of people have a hard time to distinguish the truth versus some made-up fiction and take that as a truth. Like, it's really, like, things like, all scientists are paid by Hollywood and we get millions of dollars to tell them invented stories and like things like that. And I wonder, because you talked before, how we turn basically into the tools we use, and because I see, especially in the shutdown, people were basically just using technology, nothing else, not talking with humans, including my children were mostly, the whole day in front of the screen because the school was remote on their iPads. Do you think that also contributed to that we, like Turing machines cannot distinguish between the truth and the false?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I said in the last chapter of my book, my recent book. I said, look, I'm not afraid at all of people claiming that they are going to stimulate the brain. That will not happen. I'm not afraid at all that, because it will not happen. It's impossible. The brain is not a Turing machine, as Ronald and I have written about extensively right now. What I'm afraid is that we are becoming machines. We are being, because of the plasticity of the brain and because of the kind of reward-driven kind of nervous system that we have, what I have seen during the pandemic and a little before is there's a growing number of people around the world that, without even knowing, are starting to behave according to algorithms, because that's where the rewards that they crave will come from. And they're basically losing all these non-computable, huge, incredible human attributes like altruism, intuition, creativity, empathy, because they are actually being shaped through plasticity, through the brain plasticity, to behave like automata or to behave like digital machines. That's what I'm afraid. That's what I'm very afraid of, because I'm seeing all around me happening.
Yeah, we all see it, and I think it's a major problem. This sort of robotization, mechanization of the human being, adapting to his own creation. But that is also the result of the fact that we have affirmed that what we say is the unique and the whole truth. And in fact, we must accept that there are two lines on which we are learning. We are learning technical things, algorithmic things, facts, but we are also learning more profound things, the being things, how we are, how we react, what we value, what we don't value. Today, it's much easier to bring a technical solution. It will be much easier, it will be accepted much easier because it's related to the whole system, to the financial system, to the economy. But today, our decisions are more ethical than technical. It's not important to know what we can produce, but what we should produce, what is desirable for man to produce. What we can do is something, but what is desirable? In what direction are we going? And those questions are much more difficult and much more profound and absolutely not technical.
I think this is very refreshing to hear for me. I have to say that I do subscribe to your views, and what I want to say is that I'm sure you do, but I feel that the views that you both are expressing are now becoming very rare for people who are in science, and I hear otherwise a lot. The overhype and the overemphasizing of technology, let's say even on this platform of Clubhouse, to the extent that a lot of just scientific stuff that people talk about, just like Steven Pinker, for instance, are not interesting to me anymore. And it's very rare that I find such refreshing opinion. I just had the other part of my question, and now that I have an opportunity, I want to just ask about the psychological part, in the sense that psychological problems, how far do you think, like emotional issues, etc., how far do you think that they can be? Because this is also spoken about a lot, right? The whole idea being that people are talking about technology and science is the ultimate panacea for human life. But how far do you think that the neuroscientific sort of correlates of these emotional issues or deep psychological problems, how can they be addressed at the neurological level? How far do you think that can go? I mean, I personally, again, do not think that there are certain things that we can cross. I think there is a sort of neurophysiological things that we can make better, which, like you have addressed. But I think there are some fundamental issues that human beings have to address at the level of their own psychological makeup. But I do wonder, and this is also for the benefit of people in the audience who would have been attracted to this room for obvious reasons, but may be thinking that, the applications of these things can be extended sort of to way beyond, what seems to me possible and definitely ethical or So just a comment on that would be great from both of you, either of you.
Yeah, of course, this is not trivial, but I'll take the strategy of eating the pizza by the crust first and then get into the best part later. Quickly.
I'll take the best part.
Oh, good. As I remember, you always do. But what I'm thinking for many weeks now, perhaps months, since I have been here in my apartment for so long now in São Paulo, locked in because of the pandemic, that I wanted to write an op-ed to some newspaper in the US or in Europe, in which the title would be something like that: How Neuroscience Explains the Human Shortcomings During the Pandemic. And of course, it sounds a little preposterous. Now, how could neuroscience explain, this huge thing? And of course, that is caused by a collective organism, a virus. And what I mean by that is the pandemic also exposed, like Brexit and the U.S. election a few years ago, and of course this year too, the Capitol invasion, the election of this lunatic that was elected here in Brazil. This all showed very clearly that what Marshall McLuhan predicted in the 60s, of course, you probably know this guy, is the media guru, a guy who was a Canadian scholar who predicted a lot of what would happen in terms of electronic communication before the internet even was dreamed about. He thought that with communication media that could operate at the speed of light, and he had seen what radio and TV had done to the U.S. When they came, and how profound that the influence was in human behavior, that he thought that if we could all communicate at least at the same velocity that action potentials is spread in our heads, we would form this global village, this wonderful global community in which everybody would, aim at the growth, ethical, spiritual, intellectual growth of the entire planet. And in reality, what happened is the opposite. The internet and the social media, the latest component of it, in my view, created what he mentioned briefly in one of his books, a digital tribalization. We basically, because the human brain has a few fragilities that allow information viruses that we call today fake news, I like to call it information viruses, to actually penetrate in the brains. And when you have a media that can disseminate one tweet to hundreds of millions of people in a few milliseconds, and when that virus penetrates the brain and appeals to deeply embedded prejudices and routines that are primitive and have been there for millions of years since our ancestors came out of the African savannas, what happens is you basically rather quickly synchronize millions of brains to participate, to make part, to become members of a tribe with its own cosmological view, its own version of reality, its own morals, ethics, and its own credo, its own dogmas. And, throughout history, I think that these brain nets, as I call them, exist. And in fact, they are the reason we are here, because the agility and the speed with which brains can synchronize since the beginning of our species actually allowed us to create social groups that were responsible for our ability to survive the environment around us and to evolve into this dominant species that we are now. Yet, this also has another side. And the side is exactly what we saw throughout history. Throughout history, you had different brain nets, different social groups fighting for the monopoly of the, as Ronald says, the mental space, the collective mental space of humans. And that's the reason we had the Cold War. That's the reason we had the Greeks fighting the Persians, the Egyptians fighting the Hittites, and so on. Throughout history, we had a few of these universes, parallel tribes, going after each other to try to gain the monopoly of the human mind, the collective human mind. And now, what is happening is that you don't have 2 or 3 of these tribes, you have millions. And everywhere you go, in every society that you talk to, the United States, where I have been living for 32 years, here in Brazil, Europe, it doesn't matter, you see this fragmentation, this tribalization. You cannot get a consensus about anything. And technology, the digital age, has just contributed to this process to grow in an exponential way. And that's exactly what I would like to say. The pandemic also exposed, from a neuroscience point of view, what are the dangers of the fact that our brains can synchronize with, fake news so fast and so quickly, and can basically transform that into a new religion. Okay? And that's what happened in the US, for instance, with Trump. And what happened here in Brazil with this guy that I don't dare say the name, that is our president right now. So,
Miguel, you're eating on the good part now.
No, I was just in the crust.
No, you're eating on the good part.
No, I didn't get to the mozzarella and the tomato sauce.
Well, I'm keeping them for myself. What do you think?
Oh, well, as you know, when we go to the pizzeria in Lausanne every day, I started from the crust and I saved the best for the last.
Yeah, I know that.
Because when I was growing up in Brazil, my father, my Italian Greek father used to say, if you don't eat this pizza right quick enough, the best part is not going to be there. So I had to fight my sister for the best part, But in any event, I just finished by saying that your question is wonderful, because certainly I don't think the usual tech-driven solutions will be the ones that will solve to solve the psychological issues that you raised. There are many. I think it's a complete different approach. What we need is a new illuminism. We need a new kind of humanism for our education system, for the way we raise our kids, for the way we think about global governance, for the way we handle our survival as a species. Because let me tell you, if something else happens during this pandemic, if our Ra God, the sun, has a little flare, and eject some corona in the next few months, we are done, you know? We cannot have that other incident happen in the middle of this pandemic because we are on the edge of an extinction crisis. Yeah. And it's being created by the kind of brain we have.
Well, it's important to notice that all important things are always uncomputable, unpredictable. The interesting things are always unpredictable. But I would like to have 2 or 3 points to indicate the path where we have been going since we have language. The first step I would take was, say, Aristotle. He was desperate because of the sophists who were behaving like Trump 2,500 years ago, and spreading lies and getting power out of their lies and making people believe all sorts of things. So he created the 3 principles of logic. It was the Greek grammar. What is what something cannot be and not be at the same time. Aristotle logic. He wanted to correct this possibility that language gives to say lies. Language is fantastic to communicate, but it can say truth and it can say lies. And when we are speaking of non-observable things that we cannot see or touch immediately, like the soul or something who happened 10,000 years ago and who left no traces, when we are speaking, language cannot distinguish between what is true and what is not true. And he tried to correct it by bringing language, but he failed. Leibniz took the same dream. His dream was to build a language where you could not say something who was not true. And he was inspired by Euclidean mathematics and by algebra, who was starting to come to Europe out of the Arabs. And he said, he thought, in mathematicians, when they say something, if they don't agree, they just sit down and they calculate. And they necessarily find an agreement. So why can't we build a language? Mathematics is a sort of language. Why can't we build a language who gives the same result? And he spent his life trying to build this language. He invented the binary system. He even built a computer who's still exposed in Frankfurt. But he failed. He was desperate because in those there were all those Middle Ages wars, and he saw that people could not agree one with the other, and he wanted to get this language. And the one who came next was David Hilbert. Russell had noticed this flaw in the arithmetics of Frege. This flaw was circularity. You have to start somewhere. When you have a language, when you speak, when you have verbs, the first word is not definable by description. Like in a dictionary, to define the first word, you use words who are only defined later. So the system is a closed circular system who cannot say what is true and not true. But Hilbert wanted to correct Russell's paradox in mathematics, and he started to put the whole world working on formal mathematics. Then came Kurt Gödel, who showed that whatever system you build, there will always be truths who cannot be proven true in the system. And that calmed down the whole idea of producing truth with verbal system. Verbal system don't produce truth. So you need something outside of this system. And the human brain is done in such a way that there is always something outside. In the relativistic brain with Miguel, we described a model of the brain with an analog and a digital system. When the digital system gets stuck because of Turing incompleteness, you have always the possibility to create, to do something who is not digital, to create, to imagine, to decide, and unblock the system. Truth is not a property, is not a unique property of the verbal system. It's also a feeling. The basic truth is always a feeling, a belief. So if technology will not solve everything. We need to have humanity. You need to have a being. You need to have ethics. You need to have something who's outside of a logical system. You need to have love. You need to have all sorts of feelings. And a computer cannot have feelings, because if you program a feeling, it's by definition it's not anymore a feeling. A feeling is not programmable. So that's what I wanted to add, and that was the mozzarella, the bufala mozzarella.
Well, the tomato sauce then is that our problems started with the Pythagoras guy saying that everything was numbers. You know,
Yeah.
the modern world started with that, because my ancestors in Greece believed that guy. You know, although he was a much more interesting guy that just,
But he said that, but he didn't have the same numbers as we have.
No.
In his school, people used to meditate on numbers.
His numbers were much more interesting.
Much more interesting than ours. We only took the materialistic part of Pythagoras, but Pythagoras had a spiritual part who is much deeper than the materialistic part. And you couldn't...
Yeah, it's like when I went I took my kids to watch that movie, Troy, right?
Yes.
And my father's family is from Greece. So I took that movie, the more recent, 10, 12 years ago, and Brad Pitt was Achilles, and there's a scene in the movie, the Siege of Troy, in which the Trojans attack the Greeks on the shore by surprise. And you see this Greek coming on the first plane of the movie, is screaming and saying, run, escaping, running away from the Trojans. My youngest son looked at me, Daniel looked at me and said, that's a nikoઃlɛlis. You know, that's a member of the family, running away, as quick as he could. And then I look at him and said, no, my son, we are the descendants of, the Greeks from Alexandria. The guys, Aristarchus, Eratosthenes, they said, no, you'll never convince me. We are one of those guys running away, So, there's always a second side to this story.
Exactly. Scientists in the middle of last century, they were interested by the deep questions. They always speaking about understanding the mind of God, or whatever is God, but understand they were not interested by the details. And I have the feeling that more we advance in many branches of science, in physics, we forget the big picture. We all... Do you remember when you gave your conference in Paris, there was this lady who was studying a sort of insect, I don't know what, and who spent 1 hour speaking about, was it a fly or I don't know?
No, Drosophila.
Yes.
Genetics of Drosophila, and I wanted to see the World Cup opening game.
It was terrible.
Speaking for an hour about Drosophila sex. And I wanted to get out because I was the last to speak. And the game started in 20 minutes,
Yeah. Now we are full into Drosophila. And I'm not saying it's not useful. There are people who have to do that. And that is because of economy. Economy pays for those people. They don't pay for deep thinking because it has no immediate result.
I always tell my students, what the dean of the Duke Medical School would say if a certain Charles Darwin would come to her office and say, I needed 25 years sabbatical to finish my book. Would you mind just giving me the leave of absence so I can, I have some data, but I think I need to reflect for 2 decades on what I have found. I can imagine the face of the lady, or, another guy, Newton, coming to his dean, and saying, oh, look, I'm going to take a year off just to do this kind of thing about gravity,
Do you think the 1905 papers of Einstein would be published today? I'm sure they would.
They would be rejected in Science and Nature immediately.
Immediately.
Instantaneously. But then I wanted to say something about what you just said. I have been a professional scientist for now 40 years that I have been in a lab, but a professional scientist for since '84. And I'm telling you, it's becoming a church. It has cardinals, it has a Bible, it has the guys who can speak on behalf of science, it has the black sheep, it has the guys who, because when I talk to people for the last few years, the first thing I said, okay, what do you do? And the people said, oh, I do a 2-photonic microscope. I said, no, I don't want to know what technique you use. I want to know what you want to ask. What that makes you go to the lab at 3 in the morning? Oh, no, I use a 2-photon with this dye. And so my advisor here in Brazil used to say that there is a difference between scientists and technicians. And he said, you're not going to be a technician, my son. If you want to get into this lab, you're going to be a scientist. And I remember that to get into Pythagoras Academy, you had to spend years in the admissions process,
Exactly.
And the guys would say, that guy didn't reflect about zero long enough. It's not good. Let's not get him in. And today you go to a thesis defense, 99% of the time the guy is talking about the gizmo that he used. And then he said, and then I look at this cell in the middle of nowhere and I found this, but that's irrelevant. I built a microscope. And I look at this and say, no, it's not for me anymore, or it's looking very strange. Because it's not, I love engineering. I had great engineers working with me for decades, but what we're talking about is a slightly different kind of approach, right?
And it is absolutely needed now. Why don't you say 1 or 2 words about your idea of chaos?
Well, you mean one of those ideas that have been in the drawer for a long time.
Yeah.
But, that's what I mean. I think that we lost this spark in science. Every time I visit a university to give a talk, before I give my talk, I never understood this protocol, but Katarina knows about it. You spend the whole day talking to people, and then when they tire you up, you're completely dead, you give your talk at the end of the day. And I have stopped doing a lot of that because most of the time people wanted to talk about the grant proposal that they are writing, or what they think would be a good grant proposal. So the funding is dictating how we think or how we approach our thinking. And in the U.S. today, it's very difficult to do any big idea because you cannot fund any big idea.
Well, in Europe, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
In Europe, it's exactly the same.
It's horrible. All my really basic science ideas, I cannot get funding. And all these stupid things that go again and again into just more details, they get funded. But nothing that I actually
and there are things that make these tiny little baby steps. And my father, when he was alive, he used to tell me, you have a very funny profession. I said, why, Dad? I mean, he was a judge, right? He finished his career as a state court justice here. Very, very quiet man, but he was involved in big trials here in Brazil. And he would say, no, your business is very funny. I said, why? Well, first you have a great idea, and then to approve your great idea, you have to send to your competitors who have to say whether your idea is good enough so they allow you to publish or not. But then when you publish, your competitors say that their idea was theirs. And when you send a request based on that idea to get money, they say, no, you shouldn't get this money because I should get that money. I had that idea first. And then he looked at me and said, you know what that looks like? I said, no, Dad. I was without air when he was saying that. And he said, well, it's like Coca-Cola got a new idea and he sends to Pepsi for approval. and then Pepsi said, no, that's a very bad idea. And Coca-Cola gives up, and next you know, Pepsi is marketing a new beverage out there. So it looks like you write papers to get money to write more papers to send to your competitors who will decide your fate. Exactly. Which is kind of idiotic, you know? In fact, when I got the NIH Pioneer Award in 2010, the director of NIH, Francis Collins, was, giving us the award and telling how wonderful the career of each of us was. And when it was my time, I got the award, and I said, well, I hope that the two reviewers who said that John Chapin and I need a psychiatric help are in the audience right now, because actually the thing that you dinged in 1998 actually did work. And here we are, getting the Pioneer Award for it. So if you are there in the audience, thank you very much. Because if anything, you made me swear to God that I would make this thing work just to be able to say what I'm saying now, you know? So that's the basic problem. QS is a dream of getting science done the way it should be done. In a collegial, international, no borders way, big projects, big ideas that can transform the lives of many people, that can influence in a good way the way we behave as humans towards other humans and towards the environment, towards the earth. And to some degree, I have been learning that is pretty much the way my good friend Kublai Khan used to do science. I don't know if you know that, but Kublai Khan used to call representatives of every religion to come to what is today Beijing, that he actually created, the city. And he would listen to these guys for weeks defending their gods and their dogmas and their religion. And then he would basically look at them all, Muslims, Jewish, Christians. I mean, believe it or not, the Mongols were the only place in the world that Nestorian Christians could actually survive. They could go there and say whatever they wanted because they were never being persecuted. You know, while people were burning in stakes in Europe, Kublai Khan was having theological meetings in his palace. And at the end of the day, he'll say, it's all very good, very nice. I still like the eternal blue sky, the analog God. And, that's, I think, what is missing. We are missing the kind of conversations that Einstein had with Gödel in Princeton. And Ronald has that in his book. That when Einstein was asked, what the hell are you still here in Princeton? You could be anywhere. And he replied, just for the privilege of walking every day with Professor Gödel,
Exactly. Exactly.
So I cannot imagine how Ronald could be eating pizza at 3 a.m. right now. So,
yeah.
Which is pretty much the time in Montreux right now.
No. You're 1 hour, 12 minutes late. It's 4.
Oh, it's already 4? Oh,
yes,
my God.
It's already 4.
Well, it's a new kind of Egyptian ceremony to Ra. Eating pizza on dawn, trying to tell Ra to, get rid of my collaborator in Brazil that doesn't allow me to go to bed.
But that is the thing. What makes the Clubhouse here so addictive is that I can finally have conversation with very interesting experts of all kinds of areas to talk about the big ideas and get their input, because it's very hard in conferences and because it's all very much specialized most of the time. So that's why I'm saying that this app has been very addictive to me, because if you find the right places, you find very interesting people working at very interesting projects, and then you can connect the different areas of science or even non-science and get really great ideas. So that's why
Katarina,
you're straight to the point.
You're in New York, right?
Yes, I'm in Brooklyn, yeah.
You're Brooklyn, yeah. How many times in life you thought you would be able to speak to an Egyptian Swiss mathematician eating pizza at 3 a.m. in Montreux about how Aristotle and Gödel destroyed the idea that we could be computable? Just think about that for a moment. Huh?
Exactly. That's exactly. But so I was in the GABA project where Costa was also one of your students. And our professor, our mentor, that made this PhD program, he had exactly this goal to make this without borders science think tank in Portugal, and she achieved, but then it was blocked by the EU and a lot of politicians in Portugal that wanted to keep every good scientist in Portugal, so very short-sighted.
Oh, you're talking about good old Rui Costa?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Our mentor and Professor Maria de Souza, she died from COVID, so we are trying.
Oh my God! Oh.
Yeah, but her school idea of having a science think tank without borders and PhD school was killed by the EU and also by Portuguese politicians. So we are trying to, in her honor, to continue her.
Well, I was reading, it's very proper that you mentioned that, because I was reading a book by Arthur Clarke the other day, and in the middle of the book, he says something like this. This is, 22nd century, an astronaut talking to another guy, and he say, all the bureaucracies are the same. They want to keep the mediocrity in power. They want to take the air and the idealism from the guys who think above the clouds, and they eventually all win, And he was right on the money. It doesn't matter if it's the EU, the NIH, or whatever it is. Once you have a huge bureaucracy, it's very difficult to propose ideas that go against the mainstream, even if they're correct,
Yeah, exactly. It's very sad, but yeah, we are trying to, invigorate, give it new life and reinstate that program. So let's see.
Now, that'll be good, because I think science worldwide needs a new business plan. And it's not the typical business plan that we know. It's not the typical American business plan, because that is done. It cannot work anymore. We need and the pandemic showed it very clearly. That we need a completely different business plan for science, because science also sputtered and committed, bad mistakes during the pandemic. And of course, it's difficult to discuss that when science becomes the only hope available, or the main hope available, given the political leadership is rare around the globe right now. But we have a lot of problems that need to be addressed, particularly the way we look at how we provide for society things that would be worthwhile, But that's a different conversation, I guess.
Yeah, thanks so much, Miguel and Ronald and Katerina. I really appreciate today, we talk so freely and openly, not only from the technical side, but I appreciate you guys share the story and your life experience, and even now we are talking about how we can construct the totally different science on the academic plan. So that's really profound, and I really enjoy the topic, and I saw lots of folks on the stage. So I will just do a favor, give Ronald and Miguel a little bit time to enjoy their pizza. And at the same time, we will play some music at the back, maybe for 2 or 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. And then I hope everyone can enjoy our talk today. And a quick guideline for everyone on the stage is that I know you all a big fan of the Dr. Miguel and Ronald. And maybe you have tons of questions to ask, but I appreciate everyone if you can just simplify your question and cherish the time here, because we know everyone want to get the chance to ask, and also please be mindful that I will kindly move you down to the audience if your question is answered. So please don't take that personally. I just want to give everyone the equal chance to speak with Ronald and Miguel. And yes, thank you all.
Okay, so sort of a soft reset here. We're still going to discuss for a little bit with Dr. Ronald Cicurel. I'm not sure if Miguel will be back or not, but I just had a general question to see if Dr. Ronald could get to it real quick, and then we may get to some other questions. But first, Dr. Ronald, I want to ask you how you're feeling and what kind of time frame that you have before we go much further. Dr. Ronald, are you there?
Maybe he...
Yes,
He's at time.
but I'm there, but I heard that you wanted to ask some question or discuss some subject, but then it cut off. I don't know why.
Okay, so first I was just asking, I know it's really late for you and how you're feeling, like what kind of time frame you might have to discuss maybe a little bit more, and then for everyone else too, Dr. Miguel and Dr. Ronald will be back in the coming weeks, but we'll probably just have like a little more discussion just depending on how Dr. Ronald's feeling. But how are you feeling right now, Dr. Ronald, as far as some more time to continue?
I'm feeling rather sleepy, but happy to be there.
Dr. Nikolelis will come back, but he just got some water. He will be here shortly.
Okay. So what was the question?
Okay, so let me just ask a question that just came up, and I'll see if we can do it briefly, and if anybody else wants to get to some other questions, and maybe while we wait to see when Miguel will come back. But with wondering what it was like to work with Henry Macram, because the reason I bring that up is because he seems more like the typical scientific thinker of today, sort of like popular science type view, and I would think that kind of relates to a lot of what we're talking about today and last week, what it was like to work with him, and that kind of seems like he has more of like the popular view of today, and so just what was with Henry Macram, and then we'll get to other questions after that one.
Well, I must say I enjoyed it, especially at the beginning. I thought he was a very clever man, very energetic, and he liked to speak in public, and I was intrigued. I couldn't... There was something I didn't understand, and when you don't understand, you're always intrigued. So I enjoyed working with him, but our paths diverged rather quickly because they diverged, especially when I started telling him that he shouldn't do those claims that he did. I think it was he went to give a TED conference where he said in 5 years or in 10 years we'll have a complete model of the human brain, and it will be conscious, and etc. And then I saw that I had nothing to do in that group anymore. So I think he's a very clever person, but he is, in my point of view, and I hope that if he listens, he will not blame me too much, but he's completely stuck in the system. He can't, although he's very clever, he can't think outside of the system he has been trained to. And but it's not only the problem of Henry Macram. I saw in our university here in Lausanne, I remember when I was a student, I was dreaming about knowledge, about knowing the truth, getting to some kind of truth, some kind of enlightenment, of what is in the mind of God. That's what I was taught. And I had, I must say, I was very lucky. I had great teachers. And when I came back to EPFL, I found a completely different world where we were not looking for truth. We were looking for startup and how to present projects and how to write papers and how to get money and how to be... remember the first time it struck me is when we asked money at the Swiss Confederation. I thought we needed a small amount, and we needed a small amount, but we were quickly told that if we asked for a too small amount, it will not be taken seriously. And that was a shock for me. I saw how much the economy, the financial side had gone into the university, and the dream was more making money, finding money, than having new ideas and creating new things. And that shocked me a little bit. So, Miguel is back, so he can start eating the border of the new pizza.
No, I was wondering if you had attacked the mousse already. The chocolate mousse. I came back to say, stay away from my mousse.
Well, you know that I don't like the chocolate mousse, and you always...
Yeah, I always eat yours, so
Yeah. No, but by the way, you should come to taste there's a new chocolate cake here, in the same place where we take it usually.
Which place? Which one?
You know, the LM in Montreux.
Oh, okay.
The one that Liliane gets for you, and I know you like it.
Yeah, that you told me that she made it the first time.
Yeah.
And I believe it, yeah.
Yeah, you believed it, yeah. Well, there's a new one, and you better come and taste it quickly, because...
No, tell the owner, the expert needs to come and make a new judgment.
Yeah, but he told me, but this guy was 50% of my turnover. How can I survive if he's stuck in Brazil?
Well, there's always Federal Express.
Yeah. So I was asked, how was it? How did I enjoy it working with him and Malcolm? And I said it was. He's a very clever guy, Henry, but completely stuck in the system, according to me.
Yeah, so in fact, Ronald, isn't it that quite some time ago I told you that when I go to Switzerland again, we will have dinner with Henry Macron? That was our initial conversations before.
Yeah, I don't know if he will accept to have dinner with me.
But now times have changed, because of course a lot has changed in the Human Brain Project.
Yes,
so, yeah.
Yes.
But I want to really thank you and welcome Dr. Nicolelis back on the stage. We thought that you left us, and we were all kind of crying at the back of the stage because we wanted to hear more from you, and we wouldn't want to let you and Dr. Cicurel go yet. But I know that you're sleepy. But please don't go yet for now. So I just want to I'm hoping that we can invite you again in the future. But I just want to react to what Dr. Miguel Nicolelis said earlier. I mean, from my own personal point of view, because of course, you know, Ronald, that I'm very interested in everything and anything. You know me very well. So I'm very stoked that I knew Dr. Nicolelis more than I knew him before, because he was able to connect the ideas of Marshall McLuhan long time ago with the things that he's studying and what's happening now in the neuroscience of sociology. And because basically, when we do science or when we have systems in the world, we could see that a lot of ideas are on a percolation stage. Sometimes a lot of ideas gather together, and then they're just there and nothing happens. And then at the end, you will find out that a lot of things are happening. And then you reach a tipping point. And I'm very happy to hear about the plan or idea of Dr. Nicolelis talking about his book on the neuroscience of sociology. I was just reminded by the recent book of Daniel Kahneman about noise. And it was talking about the similar thing that Dr. Nicolelis was talking about, because, of course, he has been working in cognitive biases for quite a long time, and he said that he's going to stop his work for cognitive biases because there's a lot of research on that. And then recently, he found an idea, and he had observed things about what's happening in the noise that we have because of fake news and because of technology as well, what's happening to the kind of decision making that people are doing nowadays. And I thought that based upon your work and your ideas on the both books that you had about synchronicity of humans, about the magic of plasticity and the way that humans are synchronizing ideas, and even if they don't talk, synchronicity could have positive and negative effects. And I could see that maybe in such way, such coincidence about, looking at the whole systems of what's happening, Dr. Nicolelis is thinking about his book. So I'm very happy, and I would like to be your student forever. So anyway, we welcome you back on stage, and if we have people who would like to ask questions, who had been waiting for a long time, thank you so much for your patience. We know that everybody has been longing, for this time to have both these great people on stage with us. So if you have questions, I don't know if we can do a PTR order, but for the people here on stage who haven't spoken yet, we are encouraging you to ask questions here, because this is a great opportunity for us. So who is going to ask the next question? And people in the audience too, you can raise your hands if you have questions. Just be sure that you have your bio so that we can check your authenticity. So yes, I pass the mic to Shara.
Yeah, thanks Cecile for the reset, and thanks so much for the Miguel and Ronald. Appreciate your generosity to share the knowledge, and also we really like to enjoy your love together. I will just maybe pass the mic to Kay, and I know Kay is waiting for his questions. Thank you. Yeah, Kay. Maybe Kay is not here. So Wisdom, do you want to start, maybe?
I personally study dendrites. I think overall there's an overemphasis on computation, but I do think about dendritic computation because I think it's relevant. But I've been thinking about a lot of your ideas. Right now I started your book, The Relativistic Brain, and I've been skimming your brain centric book about mental spaces. I kind of read several books in parallel. I don't know, but I'm getting to it. But I was like a lot of the ideas I've seen there, and I've been thinking about the way you talk about Gödelian information and the how in terms of it being structure and that the interactions are analog. And so I would like to hear from you a little bit about your views on, Penrose's extensions of Gödel, and because I know there's some controversy that surrounds those extensions, but I'd like to hear your thoughts about that bridge from, extending Gödel's theorems to this, thinking about Gödelian information in neurons. And that with my work, I'm thinking about, like I said, you can think about it in terms of computation, but you can also think about the structure of dendrites and the relationship between dendrites, which is, by the way, 90% of the neural tissue by volume, and its relationship to brain states, be it neuromodulation and inhibitory networks and the streaming of information. There's recently this paper out of Stanford where they did a brain-computer interface reading out from dendrites, and they used Clarity to confirm that they were getting, just by
interacting using the interface to interact with the very, very superficial layers of the neocortex, that they were actually getting information, dendritic information, from deeper layer cells. And so it's gotten me thinking about how this all might connect to BCIs as well. And then Larkham, what is his first name? Larkham. we were talking about Henry Markham, and I got it all mixed up. Matthew Larkham. They did some work talking about the differences between conscious and anesthetized animals, mammals, and that they think that there's this decoupling of superficial and deeper layers within individual neurons. In other words, these biophysical coupling mechanisms between very distal dendrites in these large output neurons is being blocked. So that transmission of contextual information as it would interact with more sensory bottom-up information in these neurons is being inhibited. So I guess I just kind of brought up a few things, but I would like to hear your thoughts on how this all relates.
Should I speak?
Go ahead.
Okay. It will be quite difficult to give you some satisfactory answer, let me tell you immediately. I would like to take the point where you mentioned Penrose's interpretation of Gödel theorem. Personally, I 100% agree with what he's saying on the interpretation of Gödel, and I think many people would. I think it was Lewis who the first time mentioned this kind of interpretation. Many people would agree with that, but it's still very controversial today. But if you look at the people for whom it is controversial, they are, how could I say, believers in, I call it ERP, they believe in external reality. If you accepting Penrose's interpretation of Gödel theorem implies that you accept that physics doesn't describe totally what is there. In fact, according to me, the confusion comes with the physical interpretation of the Church-Turing hypothesis, who is basically wrong. Any mathematician or anybody who has deeply studied the Church-Turing physical hypothesis would notice that it makes assumptions that are not justified. I support and I agree with what Penrose says about the extension, the interpretation of Turing of Gödel's theorem. There's a controversy saying that Gödel and Turing did not agree on that, and I recently read a detailed article. I don't even remember the name of the author, but he's quite a famous author, who took various papers and unpublished letters of Turing and Gödel and shows that in fact they do agree that it doesn't mean a Gödel theorem can be interpreted by saying that the brain has possibilities to do things that a computer could not do. In my book, I have expressed it in saying that the computer could only stimulate the verbal space and not the natural space. We have something who's outside of the verbal space. Now, I suppose it will remain controversial for a long time. We have spotted out the idea of Gödelian information. Gödelian information is obvious for everybody. Obviously, we cannot put everything into words. Words cannot express everything. Words are a system of expressing things who has some stability, and whatever comes from emotions or feelings is not a stable entity that can be described by some words are simply not big enough to contain the complexity of feelings. When you express something in Shannon information, you express something about something else. You don't express the thing itself, you express something about something else. When you have a feeling, it's not about something else. It is something, it is the something else. It is the primitive, the initiator. By describing everything with Shannon information and pretending like you do in the Church-Turing physical hypothesis that you can describe all of reality through Shannon information, you reduce reality to a small part of it. Reality goes well beyond what can be expressed with Shannon information. For different reasons. There are things that we simply cannot measure. There are things that when we measure, we transform them. So there's something beyond, and this something beyond is what we call Gödelian information. In the brain, it expresses this quite easily. You ask somebody to tell you what he feels. If he feels pain, you cannot measure the level of pain that somebody has. If you find a way to measure it, and this measure will not be the same for every human being, and will not even be the same for one given human being at a given moment. Every moment it can change. So I think what Miguel wrote about the recruitment of ensemble of neurons, I don't remember what year this paper is, but he will surely remind you, is one of the best expression possible of what happens. There are things who are simply not measurable. I think and that's the different information. In my book, I express it in the most simple possible way. The planets orbit the sun, but they don't know about Newton's laws. It's because of the structure of our mental space that we have fragmented, individuated in a certain part. We said there's the planet, the initial conditions, and there's the movement. And the planet is represented by a symbol and by units, and the movement is represented by a differential equation. But out there, this separation does not exist. There's one. You can't extract the planet from the movement. So this fragmentation question is a very deep question. We can only know reality through this fragmentation. But it's not the reality who is. So there is some part that we cannot measure, who is not measurable, and that's what we call Gödelian information. Because it's not measurable, it will remain controversial. Nobody can prove it. We can feel, sense in a first-person perspective that those things exist, but we cannot describe them in a third-party perspective. A third party must be communicable, must be the same for everybody, must accept that there's one reality, objective, out there. But what we live in is not something not totally something who is objective and out there. We always initiate any perception for feelings. The feelings that are at the center of things.
Can I get a point of clarification real quick?
Yes, please.
In your book, I really like that you pointed out that statement from the book. I like that when I read it about the planets in orbit, and they don't know the laws. But you also made another statement where you pointed out that it's an abusive language to say that there's an underlying code to DNA, and that DNA is integrated Gödelian information, right? And it interacts in an analog way with this environment.
I know I will get a lot of enemies with that because we are used to it.
I love it, but the reason I ask is you say that the Gödelian information isn't measurable, but we can measure the structure of DNA, right? So there's this kind of moment where this is where I get lost with Penrose, where he starts talking about his ARC-OR theory, and there's just this bang that happens in this analog system, right? So my question is, does that analog, like consciousness itself, that analog interaction, what is it that isn't measurable? Because it seems to me like the structure is, right?
No, what I'm saying is what is out there cannot be digital. It's only the verbal space who can do digital. Digital is always something about. It's not the thing itself.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But
I guess I was just trying to get you just mentioned. Sorry.
No, so when you say that DNA is digital information, we interpret it as digital information, and it works pretty well. But out there, we cannot say that things are digital out there.
I actually totally agree with you. I really, really liked that point you made in the book. My only thing is, earlier you were saying that you can't measure the Gödelian information, but like if using the DNA case, we can't, right? We can measure the structure of the DNA.
Yes, like you can measure the movement of a planet, but that's not how a planet works. That's what I'm saying. What's happening?
I guess what is the immeasurable thing?
It's like you're measuring the projection in Shannon information. You see, because the DNA also works in analog, but we created we discovered a very good approximation in Shannon information for what works. It's like when I see a sunset, I can say something about the sunset, but I'm creating a projection in Shannon space of this Gödelian information. You see what I'm saying?
I see. I like it.
Yeah, and in fact, Ronald, you know this story. Since it is almost midnight in Brazil, and there are no children in the room, I can tell this story with Penrose. Remember, in Virginia.
Tell me.
Remember, I was in a meeting with Penrose when I was a young assistant professor in the 90s.
Oh, yes, you
in a small college in Virginia. Mm-hmm. And I was, talking about my recent results, recording 100 neurons and what the principles are, and then Penrose came after me and talked about the microtube idea.
Yes.
A quantum effect in the brain. Well, I look at that and, it was very impressive. He's a nice guy, very nice guy. And I took a break, and I was in the bathroom, just having a physiological function. And long and behold, who gets into the bathroom? Professor Penrose. And he goes to the stall next to me. And here I am, this famous physicist, discoverer of the black hole, future Nobel laureate. And he looked at me, I look at him, and he says, well, I enjoy very much your recordings, but I'm dying to see what a neuroscientist thinks about my microtubules theory. And I said, well, Dr. Penrose, that was one of the most wonderful things that I ever heard in my life. He said, but what do you think? He works? I said, well, that's a complete different question. And he said, what is your judgment? I said, no chance. And he laughed, and I laughed. And 30 years later, I'm watching TV, and the guy's winning the Nobel Prize in Physics, and I'm thinking to myself, I hope he never remembered that encounter in the restroom in Virginia, because I'll never be able to talk to him again.
I don't know if I told you, but I met him in November 95 in Edinburgh, and I gave him our common book. So he said Miguel Nicolelis.
Oh.
With a funny smile on his face.
Oh, God, he remembered. I'm done.
Maybe he remembered.
No, but you mean 2015, 95 was when I met him.
No, 15. It was in 15.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Midnight, you're telling me that Penrose remembers our meeting.
Yeah.
Hi.
No, just last word to wisdom, if I may. It's what the idea of brain-centric is a very simple idea. It's very simple, and I don't think anybody can say no, it's not true. The idea is simply to say that our knowledge is the knowledge of our representation, not the knowledge of what is out there. And okay, Darwin works. We are alive. We are a species, and we have survived. So our representation for certain things must be not too bad. If they were bad, we wouldn't have survived. So, but our knowledge is knowledge of our representations. So when we come to advanced things, like some things in neuroscience, some things in cosmology, some things in quantum physics, knowing how the brain works for things that we cannot see, that we have only built, like nobody has seen an electron or a photon, we must take into account how our mental space and our brain works. If we don't take that into account, we are making pure theory. We don't know what we are doing.
But besides, if you did have any comments about whether interlaminar and dendrites matter in your mind in these BCIs, the only other clarification I wanted to get from you was when you talk about brain-centered versus this ERP. We're not talking about solipsism, are we? Or are we just saying...
No. It's very different than solipsism.
Yeah, okay.
Because
I figured so. I just...
Yeah, because we can measure things. So we have a sort of relationship with out there. But we are not describing what is. We are describing our representation of what is, of what we think it is.
Can I say something about this dendrite BCI?
Yes, please.
You probably know that the EEG signal that we all use from scalp is all mainly from dendrites, right? We are basically recording this. We're not looking at the action potentials mainly, we look at the EEG, we're looking at the fields. And when you basically do a BCI using, the dendrite signals, you're basically getting something close to what we actually use when you're looking at the EEG. We are looking at the APSPs and all the other stuff that happens there, the analog signal. And
Yeah, so for me, I was thinking about it because if you want to get more fine-grained with these like chronic implanted local things that people are thinking about, and if you want to think about stimulation being very effective and using the least amount of power and stuff with how this works, but ultimately, I think in the book you mentioned that you talk about that you acknowledge there's Gödelian information at smaller scales, you know, it's dendrites and this kind of stuff. So, yeah. And in terms of like, I get with consciousness why you would want to think about the global analog features, right? But I can't help but think that there's these local Gödelian structures are very important as well.
Yeah, but that's reason we picked that the electromagnetic fields are so important, because you can get this coupling at the dendritic level.
Awesome.
And the idea that you mentioned about coupling and uncoupling is a pretty old idea, and that's what is fascinating. I was in graduate school the first time I read. You may not know it, but this guy John Eccles, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on EPSPs and intracellular recordings and the spinal cord. He was a very big guy. He already had a paper when I was a postdoc in the early 90s talking about the history of coupling and uncoupling of dendrites of pyramidal cells in layer 5 as being the switch, between conscious and unconscious, or anesthetized and awake, or sleep, deep sleep and awake behaving. And then he postulated that would be happening through these modulatory axons, acetylcholine noradrenergic axons that get to the upper layers of the cortex and make en passant synapses on dendrites. And that was a perfect structural arrangement for coupling and uncoupling these dendrites.
Yeah, and they're landing on all the inhibitory networks that are in. And when in my book, this last book, The True Creator of Everything, that I published last year, I actually mentioned how, and Ronald and I mentioned that in our monograph, how if you start thinking about the cortex as a continuum instead of a discrete system, the whole cortex computing as an analog system, all these things resolve themselves pretty quickly. All these dilemmas that we had about Brodmann's areas and divisions of labor between the layers of the cortex, this all goes away because it disappears. But that is a tremendous resistance in the community, because I always tell this story. That Brodmann was a student of the Vogt's couple, okay? And you know what was the argument that they had? And Brodmann was a graduate student, then I think he graduated, but he won the argument because the Brodmann had the cortex divided in 192 areas. And Brodmann didn't agree and had much lower number, and they fought, and he had a fight with these guys. So long and behold, in 2016, there's a paper by the Van Essen group using MRI saying that the cortex should be divided in 180 some areas. It was like the Vogts all over again, 100 years later, just using a different technique. And who is right? My answer would be nobody, because we use arbitrary criteria to divide these areas anyway. And the cortex could care less about our divisions. It just does this stuff. So, and it does as a whole. But we are so into it, this engineering idea, that there is a computer that has areas specialized for motion, for vision, for audition, that we cannot even get out of this paradigm to think about alternative ways to compute, Totally. Thanks for answering my questions. Sorry to everybody else if I was hogging the time. I'm going to leave soon. I owe my dog a walk, but I really appreciate chatting with you and asking questions.
Yeah, thanks, Wisdom. Appreciate your time. And maybe I will give the mic to Katerina since she collected some online questions, and we hope if Miguel have time, we can go over that. But if Miguel feel that's too much, then we can go over that next time.
Hey, I'll have to leave, but I really thank you guys for organizing. I had a lot of fun. It was wonderful to meet all of you, and also, of course, a great opportunity to realize that next time I can call Ronald at 4 in the morning to have a pizza when I'm he's not going to complain, because, I had a complete different circadian image of my friend's schedule. But now, next time I'm in Montreux, my friend, just keep the phone off the ring because you may get a phone call at 4 to do margarita. Napolitana, actually, is much better.
Yeah, thanks so much, Miguel.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for your time and your knowledge. I appreciate it. So let's just flash them together for our appreciation for the Miguel and Rana. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please come back next time, and we hope it will be with Penrose. But please come back anytime.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
we probably will. Yeah.
It may be the last meeting I participate ever in my career.
with chocolate mousse and chocolate.
Yeah, with the chocolate mousse.
If you have chocolate mousse, I guarantee that I will come to be burned alive by Penrose. Don't worry.
Oh my God, I will find the best chocolate mousse in town.
That'll be fun. Well, thank you guys. Have a good whatever morning, afternoon, or night.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel.
Bye, everybody.
Miguel. Thanks, Rana. Yeah, thank you so much, Rana.
Thank you. Bye, Miguel.
Bye.
Yeah, good
Bye,
night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Rana. Yeah, we really feel sorry to keep you up so late. Yeah, but really appreciate that. So next time, I think we need find the best time which works for you, so you can have a better sleep.
Thank you, Sierra. Thank you, Cecile, and thank you, everybody. I'm sorry for having been confused. I can't even feel my tongue in my mouth. But it was a big pleasure. Bye.
Yeah, bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, everyone. In the room. I will just do a quick reset. We just talked with Miguel and Ronald about brain-machine interfaces, but we also talked a lot of different topics, and they tightly shared us with their experience, and we shared some laugh together. So really appreciate everyone here. So supportive and make our stage structured and organized. And I really appreciate everyone's time. And so sorry. Actually, we still have lots of questions, and some folks raise their hands, but we didn't have enough time to go over that. But I think we will work on together to bring the Miguel and the runners come back again next time. So thanks Sarah, thanks Abby's, Kay, and Fahi and Sarah. So I'm sorry if we didn't have time to go over your question, but you guys agree. Let's just hold that thought and talk about the topic with again next time. And thanks Katerina and Cecile, Isaac. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Shara, for your great leadership.
Thank you guys.
It went really well, and they enjoyed the conversation. I enjoyed listening to them both speak to each other. It was like a wonderful experience. So thank you so much, Cecile and Sierra.
I would just say that it was a great room.
about 3 hours, and we spoke with them a little bit before we started this room. But they did confirm that they will both be back at sometime in the coming weeks. So we'll make sure that we get to everyone's questions by then. And if you had a question on stage that we didn't get to, you can still submit it online, and we'll make sure that we get to it next time that they're back in the next coming weeks. Also, I did confirm probably in about 2 weeks I'll have Dr. Ronald Cicurel do a Zoom call podcast with me in the next couple weeks too. So we will get to all those questions, but it was a really good 3-hour show anyway, and I know it's much later for them in the middle of the night, so I think they had a good time. So thanks a lot, guys, for everything.
Yeah, thanks everyone. If let's see if anyone wants to have some final comments about the topic about the club on anything, yeah, please feel free to do so. If not, I will just close this room early since we started very early, and I maybe we will have a follow-up discussion soon, and like we can do an open mic discussion so everyone can share about your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Sierra, Cecile, Katerina. This was a really good room. Like I was really enjoying the dynamics between Miguel and Ronald, and then it's like the conversation was kind of very organic and spontaneous, and it seems like they've been friends for such a long time that they have sort of like a mutual ideas that was seamlessly flowing between themselves, and moreover, like I was really happy that I was able to talk to Miguel. I've studied some of the things that he did on like when I was doing studying to do like brain computer interface at some point, and yeah, I'm really glad that Sierra, Cecile, and Katerina, you were able to kind of bring up such influential people, or at least a person in the field, so that everybody can be acquainted with their work on Miguel's and Ronald's work. So yeah, thank you. I'm done speaking.
Hi everybody. Hello, Cecile, Sierra, Katerina. Thank you so much for moderating. I regret not having the chance to ask them a few questions, but really amazing just their scholarship and the way they were able to address all the questions that any of the speakers asked. Also, the fact that they are so open to bravely and very professionally addressing their views on the way the HCI field, neuroscience, is heading, AI is heading towards. My questions were more on the lines of Stephen Hawkins. He's the ultimate example to me in my mind, where a human and a computer is interacting, and they are almost in a symbiosis to be able to help a person convey his thoughts, live, compute, think, have his memories translated into words, and just the executive functioning. And so I wanted to ask them that when they talked about the healthcare field and prosthetics and automatized human injury or TBI or mild cognitive impairment related applications of brain-machine interface, what else can they shed light on in terms of what their theoretical understanding is about the extent to which, not necessarily the limits, but the extent to which the brain-machine relationship will continue and evolve. The other thing was about Noam Chomsky's and Reid Jekindov's theories on parallel processing from a linguistic perspective. And I thought that multiple times Dr. Cicurel as well as Dr. Miguel Nicolelis talked about that not necessarily language in and of itself is concrete about the object and their relationship to perception and how then that information gets interpreted and all of that. One thing that comes to my mind, I attend a conference here locally in the area. There were a couple of times in Seattle and Boston, the psychology of the other. And there is a topic that has come up multiple times. In fact, a Greek philosophy story or tale is utilized to show the perspective of that, how knowledge gets created. What like the old adage goes, necessity is the mother of invention. And they talk about that thing. And that thing was from the story of the vase being broken, and now the vase needs to have the ability to have the olive oil in it. It's a Grecian tale, and the idea is that the vase itself is not the important thing to procure. It's the empty space in the vase so that it can be filled with the olive oil. And if we can use that as an abstraction towards understanding our relationship to our quest for knowing or wanting to know, how far are we off and maybe perhaps by the sideways, lost or misdirected or not quite on the right path towards the brain-machine interaction, to use the psychological term, enmeshment. And then what happens when a machine can encounter, while it's performing its functions in the human and the machine interaction or interface environment or situations, things like the Barnum effect, the vagueness of the field of the stimuli, and the other thing is the Stroop effect. So at some point, cognitively, we talked about pragmatism yesterday, and I kept thinking throughout the day, this morning also, that pragmatism from a linguistic perspective is pretty straightforward, but when you think about these big philosophical and AI and consciousness related questions, then pragmatism can become very relatively subjective as well as very expansive, to a point where we will be humbled by the limits of our logical reasoning to get to the bottom of it, to get down and dirty and understand just how deep it is. That's why data mining has deep data and deep analytics and things like that. Final thing that I want to say is about, and I really wanted them to speak to all of this, but I'm asking, and hopefully later on I will get a chance. Yeah, Katerina, go ahead.
If you want to read the relativistic brain, it's their book. It's really short. It's not too long. It's around 100 pages, and they basically talk about all these topics. So their thought is that more and more usage of mechanics and AIs and computers and so on is actually the wrong path. They think it's actually turning us into Turing machines, and the Turing machines can never have the same depth and the same intuition, which is higher consciousness thinking, basically. Intuition, creativity, and all these very human traits that Turing machines cannot achieve it, and Turing machines can never have the actual human intelligence, and they explain in a lot of ways why. One is that our intelligence is embedded in the material and our organic material structure. Our material structure is also exposed to physical laws and forces, and we can't. And our intelligence is constantly adapting in a very organic way and updating the system to adapt to environments, but then so we have this conflict constantly going on, what the expectation is, and then what the new updates are from the environment. You talk now about a lot of topics, but I would, look into the book and look at the expectations that they talk about that how organic intelligent machines basically are very different from algorithmic-based Turing machines, which are very limited, and there can never be as many algorithms as possibilities there are out there, how, we will decide and behave. So I don't know if I possibly didn't answer everything, but I think some of your questions.
And also, as for your first question, I think Stephen Hawking actually had sort of a non-invasive mechanism to basically do an online keyboard. So what Miguel's lab actually was able to do is implant a very fine electrodes in the M1, which is like the motor cortex, to essentially decode or at least train some non-human primates to essentially control a virtual keyboard or a virtual mouse. And I was able to demonstrate that this is also possible for brain-to-brain interface across distances and with special spatial alignments. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, this is I think a little more advanced than Hawking's ability to kind of communicate with machines. Just wanted to point that out.
Well, also that to a large degree, well, yes and no. So, no, and sort to what Abyss just said, is that Hawking sort of interfaced with technology the same way that we're doing right now. He just used forms of technology to interact with the world, sort of like we do with our phones and other technologies, even vehicles and all that. But sort of to Sierra's point, was he did so, with Hawking, in a way to overcome an otherwise debilitating condition. So, yes and no, but what's interesting about the work of Miguel and some others that are related is probably, we're never going to have all the answers, but probably within the next decade or so, people with conditions like Stephen Hawking's will be able to do a lot more and a lot, and the things that they'll do, like he had done while he was alive, they'll have a lot more capabilities in terms of interfacing with technology and all that.
Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate everybody chiming in to help clarify my concepts. And the last thing I just read while we were talking about is this Yash Laura's, I think it's on LinkedIn, an article on ethics of HCI. So I was just reading it, and I think I'll save it for the next time, hopefully, when doctors will be able to be invited back and we can have the honor of speaking to them. Thank you so much. It's really nice. Thank you so much, everybody who moderated, and I appreciate the company here. Thanks.
Thank you. And I would just say, too, also sort of to what Katerina mentioned with their book, it's only like $5 on Amazon, and it does have the Kindle option that's cheaper than that for the relativistic brain. And then also, if you look for Dr. Ronald Cicurel's book, that one is also, it's like $20 paperback or cheaper on the Kindle version. But yeah, that'll answer most people's questions. But whether you read that or not, submit your questions through the website or Quantum Photonics social media, and then we'll be sure that we get to them when we speak to them again in the next coming week.
Yeah, just
Awesome.
a answer about the ethics. Miguel Nicolelis talked about it. So he says that the neuroscience field is going, away from what actually humans that had disabilities want. The neuroscience wants to just invent more and more cool gadgets and cool new techniques. But when he started actually, talking and interacting with patients, he realized that most of them don't really make sense. What people want is important to him. Like what patients' needs are, that they, for example, if they're paralyzed, that they can do basic everyday things again, like using the restroom without asking for help, getting dressed, or hold the bladder without any additional help. And and since he started that interaction, his goal is to develop his work towards what the actual human needs are, and not just develop fancy new gadgets that don't make any sense.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you so much, Katrina.
I think we're going to end this room in just a couple minutes, and we may have one that gets set up in a little bit. And then this was recorded with everyone's consent, so we're all within the parameters and terms and conditions of Clubhouse. And stay tuned to the social media too if you want to get the whole 2 or 3 hour recording of the conversation today, and that will be available through the Quantum Photonics social media in the next week or two. So stay tuned for all that.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks everyone for joining us. And I guess, I just give everyone a break, and I will see you hopefully tomorrow on next time you'll have the feeling to join us. Appreciate your support.
Isaac, I just had a really quick question. Is there any way you could repeat for us again where we can submit questions for the return of Dr. Cicurel? Or apologies, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I heard a quantum photonics room, or possibly to another website.
So just probably the easiest way is to go and submit it on a direct message for the Quantum Photonics Twitter or social media. There is also a link that you may be able to find with there's a Google Doc form, I believe, but probably the easiest way is just to go through the Quantum Photonics social media, which you can see listed if you click on the little greenhouse on top of this. So yeah, definitely submit there, and we'll get to the questions when they're back in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, actually, if you go to my Twitter, I pinned the tweet, so you should be able to find the Google form, which you can submit your questions there. Yeah, so I appreciate everyone, so I will close the room now, and thank you guys, and have a good night, and have a good day.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Yeah, take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.